Hello everyone, this video is going to be a bit of a different one than normal, and that's because I would like to start a new series. However, I won't be doing any playthroughs of games in this one. Instead, I'd like to talk more broadly about a franchise that I hold near and dear to my heart. That's right, I'm going to be talking a lot about Pokemon in this series. Specifically, I would like to air some grievances that I have about it. I wish to express the different ways in which I feel the series has gotten stale, how it has tried to improve on those aspects, if any, and how they could improve on them in the future. I'd like to spend each video in this series talking about one aspect of this, quote, formula, as it's known. At least that's the plan. However, I'd like to give this little intro video to provide some background of the mainline games as a whole. Just keep in mind throughout this whole series that even though I am criticizing it, I'm doing so out of love and appreciation for this franchise. I don't want it to go stale. I want it to succeed in pushing the boundaries of what a video game can and should be because it is full of untapped potential, and I think the folks over at Game Freak know this. They're just held back by limitations and perhaps some poor design decisions. I may make a video just dedicated to why the series has been getting stale, but I'm pretty sure many people already know why. Leave a comment if you want me to do it though. A side note before we get started, this script was written and recorded before the release of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. However, when you're probably watching or listening to this, those games have just been released and/or have been released for a while. As such, this video describes the state of the Pokemon mainline games prior to the release of the Generation 9 games. Also, while I'll be mostly covering what changes from generation to generation, there's no possible way I can cover absolutely everything. Because of that, I'll be talking about the most prevalent topics, controversies I can remember, and features that I did some research into. Anyway, let's go. Wait, that's from a different franchise. Well, let's go. While Pokemon had some history prior to the release of the first generation, I'm going to start there, with the first games. In February 27, 1996, Pokemon Red and Green were released to Japan on the Game Boy, followed by Pokemon Blue later that year on October 15th. These games wouldn't get released outside of Japan until around a year later for North America and Australia, and 2 years later for Europe. The last game of this generation, Pokemon Yellow, actually released in Japan shortly before the rest of the world got Red and Blue, but the rest of the world would get it a year after they got the other games. You start off as a 10-year-old in the Kanto region. You get a Pokemon, and your journey begins. First as a journey to catch all Pokemon, but along the way you become the best battler in the region and stop an evil crime syndicate. This has become a smash hit, and it's not hard to see why. Soon, the franchise was everywhere, and every kid played it. However, seeing as I was not part of the fandom at this time, as I was not alive then, I can't really comment on it. What I can say though is that it set a precedent for many of the formulaic decisions to come over the next 2+ decades. I'm not trashing this first generation of games though, as it did start the whole franchise off on the right step. At the time, it was boundary breaking, and many of the design decisions that we have gotten bored of today were not boring back then because it was a new game in a new franchise. It's only over the years that the staleness has started to seep in. For now, I'll summarize the parts of the formula that show up in most games that started with this generation. You start the game by choosing between one of 3 Pokemon, a grass type, a fire type, and a water type. All 3 of them have 3 stages in their evolution, and the grass one is usually the least popular. Until Scarlet and Violet, I guess. Pokemon Yellow is the only mainline game to not have this feature until the Let's Go games. You have a rival who follows your journey very closely, battling you along multiple steps of the way. They choose the starter whose type is super effective against yours. There is a professor named after a tree, and they are the ones that give you your starter Pokemon, give you the Pokedex, and task you with filling it out. Despite being given it from your primary mentor figure in the game and them telling you to fill it out, doing so is not necessary to reach the final credits. Throughout your journey, you will find areas that look like they lead to new places, but are blocked by some environmental object, whether that be a pond, a small tree, or a crumbling rock. Throughout the game, you gain access to HMs, which you can teach to your Pokemon, and then you can use those Pokemon to break down or traverse these blockades. The original purpose of these, whether Game Freak knows it or not, is not only to block progression, but also to enable your Pokemon to have uses outside of battle. Throughout your journey, there are 8 gyms, which feature a tough boss battle against the gym leader, who uses only one type of Pokemon. Beating them will give you a gym badge, the ability to have traded Pokemon of higher levels obey you, and sometimes a TM or HM. Progression is usually locked behind beating a gym, and you usually beat them in a specific order, although the Kanto games allow you to challenge some gyms out of order. After beating all 8 gyms, you head to the Pokemon League. Before you reach there, you have to traverse through some sort of mountainous or cave-ridden system full of high-level rock and bat Pokemon. Once you reach the Pokemon League, you present your 8 badges and challenge the Elite Four in order, which are 4 tough trainers, each with their own preferred types. Once you beat them, you can challenge the Pokemon Champion. Once you beat the Champion, you win the game, enter the Hall of Fame, and credits roll. There is an evil team. Their ambitions and goals usually differ between generations, but there is always one. They block you along your way, where you have to battle their Pokemon, which are usually the kinds found near the beginning of the game, or evolved versions of those. They usually exploit Pokemon and more often than not steal Pokemon from other trainers. Putting an end to their team is usually the climax of the story, aside from challenging the Pokemon Champion and claiming their title for your own. The team also has one main leader that calls the shots and is the final boss of their storyline. They also exploit a legendary Pokemon for their own benefit. Eventually, you can obtain and ride a bike, which speeds up your movement significantly. There are kinds of Pokemon that are bound to be found early on in the game, if not on the very first route. They are as follows. A bird Pokemon that is normal flying type, usually evolves around levels 12 to 18, and then evolves again at levels 32 to 36. A rodent Pokemon that is normal type and usually evolves around level 20. A very weak bug Pokemon that evolves from level 6, and once again around levels 10 to 12, and in Kanto there are 2 of them. 2 fossil Pokemon that each evolve once and the player can pick only one per save file, and a Pikachu clone. There are also pseudo-legendaries, which are always 3-stage evolutions and often are Dragon type, a trio of legendary Pokemon, and a mythical Pixie-like Pokemon. Pokemon usually involves attacking a wild Pokemon until it gets really low on health, without killing it, and throwing the best Pokeball type available to you. There are 2 versions of the game, with version exclusives between them. There is eventually a 3rd game released in the generation that improves upon and unifies the other 2. There's a game corner, or somewhere to gamble your life savings away for Pokemon, or prizes. There's a Safari Zone where you cannot battle the Pokemon, only catch, and it has its own catching mechanics. There are some biomes which will show up in most, if not all, future titles. There's some grand central city, a spooky abandoned building or graveyard with ghost Pokemon. There's a forest, a cave that typically needs Rock Smash and Strength to traverse, a water route that needs Surf, mountain, and there's a volcano. On the battle sides of things, there are Pokemon and attacks that have types. Pokemon take turns using attacks, the one with the highest speed always goes first. How effective a move is depends on the type matchup and any stat changes that the Pokemon may have. Finally, there are ways you can increase your Pokemon stats aside from just leveling up. This is known as stat experience in Generation 1, and it eventually becomes EVs, or effort values. And certain Pokemon within a species will start out with just flat out better stats than other ones. These are known as determinant values in Generations 1, and they eventually become individual values, or IVs. So what do I like about this generation of games? Well, aside from the fact that it was the one that started it all, it was introduced during a time when the internet was very primitive. This led to many fan theories and speculations about the game, and some of the more unexplained features of the game too. There was the mysterious Pokemon Mew and Missing No. Missing No was a glitch. And then there were false rumors of other, more powerful Pokemon, like evolutions beyond existing ones. I mean, the most popular fan theories are all from this era, like Ditto being a failed clone of Mew, Gary's Raticate dying on the SS Anne, and using strength on the truck to get Mew. I think the battle system is mostly very solid, and with the improvements made in future titles, it is one mechanic that I would feel the worst about if it were to be completely removed from the game. I also like the tree professors. It's not a mechanic that's gotten stale, and each professor has their own personality to keep them distinct from the others. Another mechanic that I liked were the 2 twists for the 2 biggest bosses in the game. It is cool to get a mystery planted very early on in the game, and in this case, it is what happened to the gym of Viridian City. Finding out that the gym leader is not only the strongest gym leader of the region, but also the leader of the evil team was really cool. Its coolness was only tempered slightly by the reveal of who the champion is. The whole game, your rival is not only a jerk to you, they are slightly ahead of you every step of the way. They got each gym badge slightly before you did and reached every milestone ahead of you. To finally have that showdown with him was super satisfying, and it's a shame it never really happened again. What don't I like? Well, the games were extremely glitchy. While some glitches were funny and not really a problem, like the Missing No glitch, others should not have been in the game. Like the 1 in 256 glitch, where all attacks that were supposed to have a 100% accuracy miss 1 in 256 times. Or there are some game softlocks like the ones involving Lorelei's Dugong. All in all, an extremely strong start to the franchise. From this point on, I'll probably be talking about each game under the framework of how they differ from past games, some agonizing ways in which they stay the same, what they introduced and refined in the formula, and my thoughts of the generation as a whole. Generation 2 starts off with Gold and Silver, which were released for the Game Boy Color at the end of 1999 in Japan, and a year later in Australia and North America. Europe would get the game a year later, and South Korea a year after that. The third game in the generation, Pokemon Crystal, released in Japan at the end of 2000, then a half year later to a whole year later for the rest of the world. It takes place in the Johto region, and the journey is pretty much the same. One thing to note is that this generation of games uses the same evil team as the previous games, Team Rocket. One big way this generation of games switched up the formula was by adding a post-game. In here you can travel back to the Kanto region and see how things have changed. You get to refight gym leaders, the 8th one being replaced by your old rival from the first game. This culminated in the climbing of Mount Silver, where at the top there was a true final boss of the game, your character from the previous game. Well, not really. He was named Red, and the gym leader was named Blue, but they used the same models as the other trainers and represented them. Red was super tough, and became the peak, pun intended, of challenge in the game. Another staple of the series was introduced here, Pokemon breeding, and along with that came egg groups and egg moves. I won't go into much detail about it here, except to say that this is another piece of the formula that I think should stay in the game. Being able to breed Pokemon is just something really logical and useful to the more hardcore fans. One big addition to the formula were the boxed legendaries. While they weren't used much throughout the story in the game, they were tied to the marketing, and each save file could only get one of them, without trading or cheating. Another huge addition were shiny Pokemon. Now that the game was fully in color, shiny Pokemon could be added. They were exactly the same as regular Pokemon, except they are a different color, and they sparkle a little when they enter battle. They are significantly rarer than regular Pokemon, causing them to be very precious and sought after. Other improvements to the battle system were made, including the introduction of Dark and Steel types, held items, Pokerus, berries, reworked type effectiveness, the splitting of the special stat into special attack and defense. Along with battling improvements came an end-game battle area introduced in Pokemon Crystal, the Battle Tower. Some additional miscellaneous additions were the day-night cycle, more Pokeball types and apricorns to craft them with, baby Pokemon, evolutions to Pokemon from previous games, Waterfall being in HM, a regional medicine, and yes, Kanto has one, but it was introduced later, and the bug catching contest. Finally, these games were the first ones to have a gym leader that didn't specialize in a specific type. Blue, the 8th gym leader of the Kanto region. He would remain the only one to have that quirk. Ever. Like, seriously, how is it that since these games, we've had 6 generations of games, 51 gym leaders, and not a single one other than Blue avoided specializing in a certain type? Anyway, what I liked about this generation were all of the changes. To be honest, they only improved upon what was established in the previous games, and by the time this generation came out, the formula had not gotten stale yet. I also liked the fights against Blue and Red, and I think introducing shiny Pokemon was a smart decision. Red Gyarados will always be my first shiny Pokemon. Sorry, Ponyta. Visiting a past game's generation is always a cool idea, although I understand why it's not in the newer games. In addition, my favorite shiny Pokemon also comes from this generation, that being shiny Umbreon. What I didn't like was how comically easy everything was up until Lance, the champion. After that, things were easy again until Red. I mean, the game was already fairly easy, but to somehow make it even easier, there was a built-in chance for all status moves, only used by your opponents, to miss. Anyway, I don't have much more to say about this generation of games. On to the next one. Generation 3 starts off in the Hoenn region with Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, which was released in Japan at the end of 2002, and for the rest of the world in early to mid 2003. After this was the first remake and the start of each generation, except for Unova, having a remake. In early 2004, Japan would get the remakes of Pokemon Red and Green, Pokemon Fire Red, and Pokemon Leaf Green. The rest of the world would get those games later that year. Soon after that, Pokemon Emerald released in Japan late 2004, and the following year, the rest of the world would get that game. The move from Game Boy to Game Boy Advance came with better graphics, better sounds, and all around more. This is also the first generation I had exposure to as a kid. I would later go on to see the previous games, but this generation was and will always be my first. The new generation of games also came with their own changes to the formula. Pokemon contests were introduced as something you can do with your Pokemon. There were 2 different evil teams and the story would revolve around one of them, depending on if you were playing Ruby or Sapphire. And in Emerald, there were just straight up 2 different evil teams. The Hoenn region is the first and only region to have a doubles battle as a gym battle with the twin Psychic-type gym leaders Tate and Liza. How could I forget that this is the only game where we have a dad? And he's a cool gym leader too. This entry also introduced the Dive HM and Secret Bases. This generation also had a second mythical Pokemon aside from the pixie-like Jirachi, and that was the alien Deoxys. This generation, along with the previous one, were the only ones to have non-Dragon-type pseudo-legendaries with Johto's Tyranitar and Hoenn's Metagross. Sure, Staleness was also a pseudo-legendary from this region, but it's a Dragon-type, so it stands out less. This game added 2 types of bikes instead of 1. The Acro bike would let you do tricks on the bike and allow you to traverse certain types of terrain, and the Mach bike, which would go faster and thus allow you to go up muddy hills. This generation of games is the only one since the introduction of the day-night cycle in Generation 2 to not have it. This was also the first game that has a desert biome, a feature that would be present in all future titles, except for the Crown Tundra DLC for Sword and Shield. In addition, Four Tree City was the only one to feature tree houses, and Sootopolis City was in the middle of an inactive, partially underwater volcano, and that was really cool. There was also a mechanic where, when traveling up the volcano, it covered the tall grass with ash, and you could walk through it and collect the ash, later being able to have an NPC turn the ash into items. While the future games would have active volcanoes, none of them would actually do anything with the ash produced from it, which is a shame. Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald also had 2 rivals with either Brendan or May, and Wally. Wally was an incompetent battler. Sorry buddy, but it's true. So Brendan/May kinda took the role of the primary rival. The Generation 1 remakes came out with the Sevi Islands, which were a way to get the Hoenn and Johto Pokemon without having to travel to the respective regions, and that was good enough. Over on the battle side of the changes, stat experience and determinant values were finally changed over to effort values and individual values respectively. This game introduced abilities and natures, which were really good ideas and solid ways to add to the battle mechanics. These games also had more Pokemon to work with. So much, in fact, that Satoru Iwata, the president of Nintendo at the time, had to help them figure out a way to efficiently store all of the Pokemon within the cartridge. Nowadays, it's no big deal. But back then, having memory limitations wasn't as simple as upgrading to the next size up of storage. Double battles were also introduced, which were a fun twist to the battling system, but they could have used it more often. The Battle Frontier is this generation's version of the Battle Tower, and it is widely considered by many to be the best Battle Tower system out of all the Pokemon games. All in all, I really like this generation. Although there weren't as big of changes to the formula like the Johto games, I felt they refined it enough to be the definitive Pokemon game, at least at the time. They didn't need to be ambitious, as they were already having to jump to higher quality graphics and audio, as well as they were having the aforementioned storage problems. The final result in Pokemon Emerald was honestly one of the highest quality Pokemon games to ever come out. Because of this, I don't really have too much to say in terms of what I didn't like about this generation of games. I suppose, if I had to say something, it had too much water. Pokemon Diamond and Pearl released at the end of 2006 in Japan and Taiwan, then in mid-2007 for the rest of the world, except for South Korea, which got it February 2008. The definitive version Pokemon Platinum would then release the following year with a similar pattern, first releasing in Japan and Taiwan in the late 2008 and early to mid-2009 for the rest of the world. Yet again, the pattern holds true for the next set of games released, Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver, which released in late 2009 for Japan and Taiwan, and then early 2010 for the rest of the world. This new generation of Pokemon games also came out on a new system, the Nintendo DS. Along with this came semi-3D world graphics, and yet again, higher audio quality. Battle graphics were still in 2D, however. With the Sinnoh games came the Underground, the Rock Climb and Defog HMs, a ton of evolutions to Pokemon from previous generations, and the Distortion World in Pokemon Platinum. The remix added the Pokeathlon, which is really good. I think the more there is to do with your Pokemon outside of battling, the better. The Pokeathlon showed a whole other version of training your Pokemon. Instead of mastering fighting, you could have them become extreme athletes. I think the biggest thing this generation of games improved upon was the lore. We now had a god. There was also a ruler of time and a ruler of space. We even had our own devil-like Pokemon. Aside from that, there were tons of other legendary and mythical Pokemon representing different things like nightmares, dreams, volcanoes, sea guardians, and Reggie Kickass. Shaman was there too, I guess, and who could forget about the Pokemon of willpower, emotion, and knowledge. It introduced Pokemon that can possess machinery, and also the most terrifying encounter known to man. I have to mention Looker, who is my personal favorite NPC in the series. I also say this because he comes back in the next 3 generations of Pokemon games. It also had Pokemon Contests, which was reworked from the previous generation. Unfortunately, this would not make a return until its remake in Generation 8. This game introduced the Swamp Biome, which would return in future titles. Another huge feature is that Pokemon actually follow behind you when you walk around. It's limited to one area in Sinnoh, but in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, every Pokemon can follow you around everywhere, but limited to one at a time. It's a shame that this feature wouldn't return until Generation 8's Sword and Shield, Isle of Armor, and Crown Tundra DLC. On the battle side of things, the biggest change is that attacking moves are now physical or special, independent of their type. That means you can now have physical fire moves like Fire Punch, and special fighting moves like Focus Blast, for example. In addition, the battling community grew significantly now that it could be played on a system that can connect to the Wi-Fi. Although, it can no longer do that. Rest in peace, Nintendo DS Wi-Fi. One thing about this game that I think is widely known, but I still think should be pointed out, is that it is so slow. It takes forever for health bars to drain, for animations to play out. Hell, it even takes a really long time to save the game. Luckily, I think Pokemon Heart Gold, Soul Silver, and Platinum fixed this up a bit, and the next generation of games became even faster. As a whole, I think that the game changes up the formula even less than the Hoenn games did. This will also happen for each of the following generations until Sun and Moon, but more on that later. For now, I will say that Pokemon has definitely settled on its formula by the time these games got released. At this point, many fans have started to grow tired of the formula. Not all, probably not even most, but many. It's now a yearly franchise that delivers a new game, annually. I think this starts to take its toll on the overall quality of the Pokemon games, however, but the quality doesn't start declining yet. Rather, the amount by which each generation improves starts to really slow down here. This game wasn't super experimental, but it did flesh out some of the grander Pokemon lore, something I'm sure many Pokemon fans are appreciative of. Now we know the origin story of the universe, at least in the Pokemon world. All we need now is a Pokemon game with a really solid story. Oh, would you look at that, the generation of games with the best story. By this point, the franchise has been releasing games for 14 years at a rate of pretty much one game a year. They have solidified themselves in the market and were just chugging along. The formula had been pretty much set in stone since Generation 3, and every year since, the game feels almost exactly the same, minus the changes in the graphics. In this aspect, Generation 5 does not break the mold. It started out with Pokemon Black and White, which released in 2010 for Japan and early 2011 for the rest of the world. The sequels, Pokemon Black 2 and White 2, would follow in its footsteps, releasing in Japan mid-2012 and for everyone else later that year. This would prove to be the start of one of the permanent changes to the formula. There would now no longer be any third and definitive release of a game. From now on, they would focus only on the games and the remakes, or in this generation's case, the game and its sequels. So, what was different specifically in the games? To start off with, seasons were added. They cycled monthly, and maps would change to reflect the current season. In spring, puddles would form everywhere and it would rain more often. In winter, snow would pile up in places, allowing you to reach areas you couldn't in other seasons. Stuff like that. Some Pokemon would only show up in different seasons, and the Pokemon Deerling and its evolution Sawsbuck would change their appearance to fit the season in which they were encountered. This was the first region to not be based off of a region in Japan, instead being based off of New York City in the United States of America. As such, there were no older Pokemon available to trainers until the post-game. Because of this, the region had to be filled with completely new Pokemon. There was a huge variety of monsters ranging from great, like Volcarona, Zoroark, and Hydreigon, to lame, like Stunfisk and Trubbish. Side note, I actually like Trubbish, but it's often cited as being the weakest design Pokemon has ever come out with, but that's neither here nor there. The games also experimented more with online and local wireless functionality with the Dream World and the Entralink. The Dream World was a website where you could connect to your game and do miscellaneous things like garden, decorate a home, play mini-games, and befriend Pokemon. Once players have done so, they could visit the Entralink to catch Pokemon they befriended online. Unique to Black and White, and not their sequels, was visiting other people's worlds through the Entralink. While very limited, it was very neat, and the feature would not return until maybe Scarlet and Violet. I wouldn't know. The game hasn't come out yet at the time of writing this video. I am aware the wild area and DLC areas of Sword and Shield, as well as the Sinnoh Underground, somewhat replicate this, but that's less visiting other people's worlds and more of players visiting an online or local lobby. Along with these changes came a higher emphasis on 3D elements in the level design. All across the region, you'll find stairs, ramps, over and underpasses, waterfalls, the lot. While the previous generations had this, Unova was really where it started to feel less like the 2D games and more like the 3D games. Since the other games in this generation were sequels, they made some significant changes to the map. The southeastern part of the map was now the starting area, and the player would take a boat to visit the rest of the region. The gyms were changed around, adding Aspertia City, Burbank City, and Humalau City, each with their own gyms, which replaced the Stridon, Nacrene, and Isurus gyms. Flauchasea Town and Lentimas Town were added too, and the Route 10 no longer exists, which is a shame, because the theme was exquisite. Over the course of the plot, the map would actually change, with Opelousas City and parts of neighboring routes freezing over. In Black and White, the southern part of Driftvale City was the cold storage, where the evil team, Team Plasma, was partially operating out of. In Black 2 and White 2, it was replaced with the Pokemon World Tournament, where the player could battle and fight famous trainers from previous generations, namely the Gym Leaders, Elite Four, and Champions. Replacing the Nimbasa Gate was Join Avenue, another multiplayer venture. As the player connected with others, Join Avenue would expand with more shops. It was a neat idea, but as I was the only one I knew of that played these games as a child, I never engaged with it much. I think the biggest change was not in any one particular feature, but rather the overall feel and tone of the games as a whole. This was the first game to be set in a region completely separate from the other ones, with absolutely zero older Pokemon available until the post-game of Black and White. As such, there are some Pokemon that fulfill similar roles to the Kanto and Unova regional Pokedexes. The dialogue being more serious also contributed to this shift in tone. This one is a little harder to explain, but there's definitely a notable tone shift between Generation 4 and 5. Time for some miscellaneous changes. I like to think that this was the first game that had a city that truly felt like a city. I'm referring to Castelia City, of course. It had ports, pedestrians, skyscrapers, and more. Game Freak did a really good job at that. In addition, the camera was a lot more dynamic in this game, with cases of it rotating around Castelia cities and zooming in and out as you traveled across Sky Arrow Bridge. The endgame battle facility was the battle station, with characters showing up in later games, namely Ingo appearing in Legends Arceus. In Black 2 and White 2, in Vermig City was Pokestar Studios, a place where trainers could go to have their Pokemon act in movies. It was a really cool idea and replaced the contests of the previous 2 generations. This game was also the first game to have fusion Pokemon, with the legendary Pokemon Kyurem fusing with either Zekrom or Reshiram. This idea would take place again in Sun and Moon, with Necrozma fusing with Solgaleo or Lunala, and again in Sword and Shield's Crown Tundra DLC with Calyrex fusing with either Glastrier or Spectrier. Wild battles could sometimes be double battles if in the taller of the tall grasses, and you could only throw a Pokeball if a single opposing Pokemon was left standing. The low health beeping noise was changed into a song, which is such a bop. Something they should do again. Every Pokemon has an idle animation that plays during battle. In Black and White there were 2 rivals, Bianca and Cheren. Bianca was more energetic and hastier, while Cheren was quieter and more calculating. Cheren was the better battler, and thus became the primary rival, at least in terms of challenge at battle. I suppose N is also technically a rival too, but he's so much more different than the rest of the rivals, I kinda didn't even realize he was one, until the Bulbapedia page on Rivals pointed out that he was one. This was also the first generation without Pokemarts. Instead, players could access the typical shops inside of the Poke Center. TMs were no longer single use. And now for the battle changes. This was the first game to implement triple battles and rotation battles. Triple battles were 3 versus 3, but the Pokemon on the ends could not target opposing Pokemon on the opposite side of the battle arena. Rotation battles were also 3v3, but slightly different. It was essentially 1 versus 1, but before each Pokemon makes their move, trainers can rotate their active Pokemon to be another one of the 3 that were on the field. The 2 inactive Pokemon didn't get to do anything until they were rotated in. After rotation, each active Pokemon got to make their attack, meaning after choosing if you would rotate, you would choose the move for the Pokemon that would end up being active. So how good was this generation of games? Well, Black and White are still my favorite Pokemon games to this day, except for maybe Legends Arceus. Nothing since has even come close to topping it in my mind. Many people consider this to be the peak of Pokemon games, as the generations after this one start to drastically decrease in quality. More on that later. Famitsu actually gave Black and White a perfect 40 out of 40 score. What's even weirder was that people were kind of repulsed by Black and White when it first came out. Many people didn't like that it took place in a completely new region with completely new Pokemon, and that, in their eyes, the Pokemon designs have decreased in quality. I guess to summarize my thoughts and feelings toward this generation is that I like all of the changes that they added. This was pretty much the complete package, and even though nowadays the online functionality has been removed, it still stands the test of time. I think this is the first and only time the morality of Pokemon catching really becomes a major plot point in a Pokemon game. Multiple times throughout the story you meet N, and he's constantly going on about how people are forcing their will upon Pokemon, and that's why he's a part of Team Plasma. They wish to liberate Pokemon from people. It is also established that he can communicate more closely with Pokemon than average trainers can. That's why he gets so confused every time he meets the player. The player's Pokemon clearly love their trainer, which goes counter to everything N believes in. By the end of the story, he's realized that Pokemon and trainers can, and do, in fact love each other, and that Team Plasma's motivations were kind of a sham. It's really deep stuff. I really wish Game Freak would just have a story as deep as this in a future title. My least favorite part of this generation actually is something I haven't mentioned yet. They made each version of the game a lot more different than in past games. In the previous generations, the most different it got was Team Aqua and Magma being exclusive to Sapphire and Ruby, respectively. But that wasn't much of a problem because you could just buy Pokemon Emerald and get the best of both worlds. Black and White never got a Pokemon Gray, or whatever it would be called, so as a child whose parents would only buy things for him once a year, I was only restricted to seeing places like White Forest and the old Opelucid City. It's honestly just a minor gripe though. Anyway, let's move on to the next generation. Alright, now we're about halfway through the 8 generations of games. Hopefully you've been able to follow along so far and can see how things have only gotten better up to this point. If you haven't already, I'd suggest pausing the video, taking a break, and maybe getting a bite to eat or something to drink as we start to explore. Not gonna lie, before X and Y came out, I was very excited. I was really ecstatic to see my favorite franchise make the jump to 3D and couldn't wait to see how much it improved. While my hopes weren't dashed exactly, they were certainly put in check once the game finally came out. It was merely serviceable. Definitely not up to what quality standards I thought Game Freak had at the time. All this criticism wasn't fair for me to give, at least at the time. Game Freak was really good at making 2D games, but they still had a lot to learn with making 3D ones. That much means that they can kind of get a small pass for Pokemon X and Y. It takes a lot to make entirely new assets for the game, and figuring out how things would translate to the new format probably took a lot of work. But enough generalization. Let's get into the thick of things. Pokemon X and Y released in October 2013 worldwide for the Nintendo 3DS, the first worldwide release of a mainline Pokemon game, in fact. It was set in the region of Kalos, which was based on France. The next year, on November 21st, Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire were released everywhere, except for Europe, where it came out only a week later on November 28th. These games were the Hoenn remakes, specifically Ruby and Sapphire. There were no other mainline games this generation, no matter how much people wanted to believe Pokemon Z or Delta Emerald would be a thing. Instead of going from biggest changes to smallest, let's do a bit of the opposite and go smallest to biggest. At least for the semi-significant changes to the formula in X and Y. Starting off with the Battle Maison. It was the battle tower for this game, and it would feature several trainers that would increase in difficulty the more you fought them. Side note, it was also in the Hoenn remix in place of the Battle Frontier. Anyway, there's not much to say about it. Next is the Friend Safari. By using the 3DS's Street Pass feature, you could befriend nearby players and unlock new areas of the building. Each area would have a single type of Pokemon, and the individual species were not usually found in Kalos. The shiny chance was also slightly increased there. Fun fact, my first shiny Pokemon that I caught in the series was at the Bug Zone in the Friend Safari. It was a Cascoon. Until I evolved it into a Dustox. Here it is. No, before you ask, it's not named Bogene or Beauregard or whatever. The roller skates were another feature unique only to this game, and they allowed you to freely roll around the various routes, towns, and cities. It was much better than the running shoes. In addition, a few places will have special rails that you can roller skate on, and you can even do a few tricks with them. The Bas de Mer Ranch on Route 12 allowed you to ride a skidoo. While not entirely useful, as it was limited to that route only, and while riding skidoo, you couldn't do anything else like interact with NPCs or encounter wild Pokemon, I think this is a bigger feature than at first glance though, because I think it was indicative of Game Freak experimenting with riding various Pokemon, an idea that would come back in all future games, except for Sword and Shield, and Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl. This generation would also bring back themes of morality, but to a much lesser extent than Black, White, and Black 2 and White 2. Namely, in X and Y, it is revealed that the character the plot centers around, AZ, had a Floette that died, but he tried to massacre thousands of Pokemon to get enough energy to power his machine that would bring it back to life. This raised the moral dilemma of whether or not that was a good thing to do. Hint, it wasn't. Team Flare, the evil team, tried to use this machine for evil, as you can probably expect. While the previous generation had 2 rivals, technically 3, this one had 4. Calum, or Serena, depending on which character you chose at the start, Shauna, Tierno, and Trevor. Honestly though, this was one of the many low points of X and Y. With so many rivals, it was hard to develop a bond with any of them. Tierno and Trevor's journeys really don't have much to do with the players, so they are treated as rivals, but don't interact with the player as much as a rival should. In fact, they are so forgettable that I don't remember their names. Or at least I didn't when writing the script, and I had to look them up again. Tierno's whole arc is him discovering that he likes to dance. While that's fine, and doesn't make me hate Tierno, I still don't think he needed to be in the plot. In fact, we only battle him a total of 3 times throughout the whole story. Who do we even see less of? Trevor. We only battle him twice throughout the entire plot. He's so forgettable, I don't even remember what his whole gist is. From what I can glean from reading his dialogue on Bulbapedia, his whole journey is about filling out the Pokedex? Maybe? It's hard to tell. One thing is for sure, the story would have been better off without these 2. Maybe then it could have focused more on developing Serena or Calum and Shauna's characters, as both fill a very similar role, and there could be more to distinguish the 2. At least with Cheren and Bianca, they are different people that you can see start to discover what they enjoy doing. Cheren becomes a Pokemon trainer and then a gym leader in the sequels, while Bianca becomes Professor Juniper's assistant researcher. And this journey is similar to Beat and Hops in Sword and Shield, but the journeys to get to those points is different. Pokemon X and Y also had my favorite post-game, as it involved working for Looker. Of course, it would be my favorite because of that. To quote Bulbapedia, the player first meets him after receiving an invitation to come to the Looker Bureau. During their first case, he meets a homeless young girl named Emma and her Esper named Mimi, whom he decides to take under his wing. He becomes a father figure to the girl, but because of their poor living conditions, Emma feels she is a burden to Looker and decides to look for a job to help support him. She finds a job at Lysander Cafe, and her employer turns out to be none other than Xerosic, who uses Emma as a test subject for a special suit that has a cloaking device and can power up any Pokemon the user has. Xerosic remotely controls the suit and makes Emma commit various crimes, although she is completely unaware of what she is doing. Looker and the player manage to rescue her, and Looker arrests Xerosic and leaves Kalos. He leaves a letter with Mimi that reveals his real position as a member of the International Police and that he is paid for the property in full so that Emma may continue to call the Bureau home and use it however she pleases. He also transfers his codename Looker to the player character. This is merely a story point and has no impact on the gameplay. Yeah, nothing else to say, I just had to mention my favorite post-game plot, I guess. These games also changed how the EXP share worked. I haven't mentioned it previously, but now I mention it because the older system was fine, but X and Y actively made it worse. In the older games, except for Generation 1, it was a held item that you could give to your Pokemon. After an enemy Pokemon faints, even if the Pokemon holding the EXP share didn't participate in the fight, they would get some of the experience. This was changed in X and Y to make it not a held item. Instead, it was a key item that was toggleable. When on, all Pokemon in your party act as if they are holding the EXP share, and when turned off, no Pokemon get those effects. This was another divisive decision made by Game Freak, and it is one that I actively disagree with. I think it should be toggleable between party members, so if you only want 2 of your Pokemon to share the XP with the battle participants and not the other 4, then you should be able to do that. I think that's a good compromise, with it not being a held item and accessible to all party members. Anyway, this generation would introduce Pokemon Ami, a feature which would go through multiple iterations ending with the Pokemon Camp in Sword and Shield. I think Scarlet and Violet will have something to do regarding this feature, but as the game is not out at the time of writing the script, I can't really say yet. Pokemon Ami was a way for players to interact more directly with their Pokemon. Using this feature, you could play with them either through minigames or just by using the 3DS's touchscreen. You could rub their bellies, pat their heads, even make facial expressions at them, and they would respond. I really like this system, and I think it should come back in some form, along with Sword and Shield's Pokemon Camp. In general, I think that the game should retain battling as their primary form of interacting with Pokemon, but there should also be other things to do with them aside from battling. I think that's why I'm so fond of ideas like the Pokemon contests, Pokathlon, breeding, making movies with them, and now playing with them using Pokemon Ami and Pokemon Camp. Unfortunately, this feature also enabled a kind of controversial topic: Pokemon affection affecting battles. To be clear, affection has always affected battle since the introduction of moves like Return and Frustration in Generation 2. However, it would not have as big of a role until this generation of Pokemon games. This is because now, if one of your Pokemon were to have a high enough affection toward the player, they would start doing better in battle. They might withstand a hit that would normally kill them, shake off a status effect, or deal a critical hit when they normally wouldn't. As a whole, I like the idea of this happening, as it gives a mechanical benefit to growing closer to your Pokemon, but I don't like how massively the tide of battle changes because of this effect, which is RNG, by the way. To be clear, none of these affection effects happen in online battles, only during single-player battles against NPCs and wild Pokemon. I also don't like how all of this happens just because of the power of friendship. I also don't like how Pokemon with a high enough affection will interrupt a battle when they are immediately sent out to say something like, "Your Pokemon is bored and wishes to be elsewhere. Your Pokemon glances at you funny." Or if they get hit to red health, "Your Pokemon will die soon, you should probably switch them out." The Pokemon battles already get interrupted enough, and adding more interruptions only makes the game drag on. Now we're on to the really big features. Starting up, the introduction of the Fairy type. This is another of the features from this game that I personally like. I understand that initially people weren't fond of this decision, but I could see the reasoning behind its inclusion and supported it. Essentially, this type became a thing for balancing reasons. Dragon types were too strong, and poison types were too weak. Well, so were bug types, but they would get their own buffs next generation with increases to damage in some of the common bug attacks. Fairy types were the bridge to that problem, being super effective against dragon types and immune to incoming dragon type attacks, and also being weak to poison types. With this change came the retyping of multiple Pokemon from previous generations, such as the Marill line becoming part Fairy type and the Snubbull line becoming pure Fairy type. Overall, I think it's a sensible feature. While I originally had this next feature as slightly less significant than the introduction of Fairy types, upon further thought, I came to realize that maybe this was more. I'm talking, of course, about Mega Evolutions. Fairy types were introduced, and while there was some discourse around the time of its inclusion, I feel the majority of fanbase has now just accepted it. That's why Mega Evolutions were more impactful to me. They are still talked about to this day, and Game Freak feels that they need to top it every generation. Essentially, while Mega Evolutions is a pretty big feature, because it set a dangerous precedent that every future generation needs to have its own battle gimmick, it actually had a bigger effect on the series as a whole than the introduction of fairy types. Why is this so controversial? I think it's mostly because Game Freak keeps bringing in new battle gimmicks every new generation, but beyond the games they come in, they refuse to expand upon existing ideas, resorting to ditching their old ideas and trying out new ones instead. I think people don't realize it, but they actually started doing this in the previous generation with triple and rotation battles, which never returned in any future Pokemon games. Some people dislike Mega Evolutions, as well as triple and rotation battles at the start, but now I think people would rather have them in the game and be optional rather than not at all. The same goes for Z moves, but that will be discussed when we talk about Sun and Moon. And it's not like Game Freak isn't afraid of expanding upon and refining existing ideas. Ideally, I think ideas like these should return and be expanded upon rather than left out and willingly forgotten about. Of course, people might bring up balancing issues and feature bloat, but I think balancing is something most games actively seek to do through post-release patches, something Game Freak has never done, at least in the battling scene. All patches have been bug fixes and compatibility issues, except for in Pokemon Legends Arceus, where they actually did add new quests and one new feature. And as for the feature bloat, I have a very simple solution. Stop introducing new gimmicks. We already have 3 big gimmicks, with Megas, Z-moves, and Dynamax. And soon to be there will be a 4th one with Terastallization. We can just have it stop there. I think another source of frustration in fans that this feature brings about is that they spend effort to get something powerful or useful in the game, but it never comes back. They can't utilize the thing they worked hard for. Like, imagine you train this really good Audino for battle, pouring hours into leveling it up, EV training it, making sure it had the right egg moves, nature, IV spread, and whatnot. But the whole reason why it was on your team was because it made a really good Mega Audino. But without Mega Evolutions, it just goes to the wayside. You put so much work into making it the best Audino it could be. But after the game it debuts in, and Sun and Moon and Ultra Sun and Moon, it just immediately becomes unusable. Not because it's bad, but because it literally does not exist in the current game. Those are the main reasons why I think the introduction of this feature has been such a hot topic. It's not the Megas themselves. It's the fact that Game Freak keeps introducing things that you can spend hours working toward, but they won't be present in future titles, leaving to people feeling like their time was wasted. My main gripe with these games is that I found them very forgettable. The story felt kinda short. I never felt any emotion toward the NPCs one way or another, and the region itself just didn't grab me as much as the other ones. In fact, what I do remember the most about the game, aside from the post-game, I remember Geosenge Town being blown up, I remember easily beating Diantha the champion, and I remember being given a Mega Lucario after beating a really easy battle. I also remember the Ghost Girl, but I have no qualms about that part. I like my spookiness in my Pokemon games, but not the toned-down child spoopy. The legit mysterious spookiness is what I enjoy. I guess this brings me to another common complaint that I hear a lot about the modern games: the difficulty. I mean, we fans aren't asking for something like playing against chess computers level of difficulty, but we want some challenge. I think it would add a lot if you need to worry more about the type effectiveness chart, and to that extent, the game tells you about whether an attack versus a Pokemon that you've encountered before will be super effective, regular effective, not very effective, or not effective at all. While I don't personally think this is a bad addition, it definitely makes the game easier, along with the permanent EXP share and the increasing hand-holdiness Game Freak seems to be striving for. This is definitely more of a vague, non-specific gripe, but it definitely is prevalent. and I'll discuss it more in the Sword and Shield section because it gets especially worse there. Woof. That was a tough bit to get through. Now let's move on to the changes that ORAS introduced, which there aren't nearly as much of those. Namely, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire introduced the Aeon Flute and the Delta episode. I think the Aeon Flute was the next step in Game Freak experimenting with riding Pokemon after the Skiddo Ranch. Essentially, sometime in the story, the player gets the ability to call forth either Megalatios or Megalatios and use it to fly across the Hoenn map. Players would still be able to use the HM Fly, but the Aeon Flute made it unnecessary, which was a good thing. It also had a banger theme in both daytime and nighttime, but also enabled part of the post-game of catching various legendaries that Hoopa would bring into the Hoenn region. Ultimately, it was a really good feature to introduce, and for those that thought that using it took too long, which it didn't, they could still use HM Fly, so it really wasn't a problem. The Delta episode was the newest thing that the games introduced. It was the post-game, where you follow Lorekeeper Zinnia around and learn more about the history of the region, particularly about dragons. It culminated in an epic scene where you catch and ride Rayquaza up into the atmosphere to fight Deoxys, who is hurtling toward the Earth. A small reference to a fan theory about how to catch Deoxys in the original games. The post-game also touches upon themes of morality, as the scientists in the region want to use this special technology to teleport the meteor containing Deoxys to another dimension. But Zinnia defends this, saying that even though we don't interact with anyone from that dimension, they are people too, and sending Deoxys there will still cause the deaths of many. I don't think this adds or changes much about the formula, I just wanted to mention it because it was really cool, especially those Rayquaza and Deoxys fights. Oh, and also, Zinnia's theme might just be my favorite individual song from the Pokemon franchise, period. It's like too good. Since this is a series about the growing staleness of the Pokemon franchise, I think it's worthwhile to go over what has not changed, especially now that this is the first generation where the overall quality starts to decrease. Keep in mind that while Game Freak keeps introducing new features, they keep forgetting that changing the formula is an equally valid and honestly at this point preferred way of adding freshness to the series. If they keep tacking on temporary features, it starts to feel like they're putting band-aids on problems that exist, except these band-aids are trying to cover up problems that are far too big for a band-aid to solve. Starting off with the gym structure. Every game up to this point had 8 gyms, an Elite Four, and a champion to beat as the part of the main plot of the game. Every one of them had an evil team that served as the main source of conflict within the main story, and that usually came in the form of causing a bunch of destruction to the world. Game Freak had only started to experiment with changing up HMs in this generation through the Skiddo riding and the Aeon Flute. Let's head on over to Alola, a region based on Hawaii in the United States of America. To start off with, this generation began with the release of Pokemon Sun and Moon in November 2016. It would then be followed by Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon on November 2017, which weren't sequels to the original games, but rather a rework of it. Finally, with the introduction of the Nintendo Switch, Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee were released in November 2018. Let's start talking about Pokemon Sun and Moon. Something to mention first is the map of the region. Compared to previous games, this region had completely separate islands. Along with this came some commonalities between them. For example, every island had its own legendary guardian that started with Tapu and was part fairy type. They also had their own island Kahuna, which is the strongest trainer on the island. Anyway, I think the first thing people noticed about this game when they first play through it is that there aren't any gyms. Instead, there are trials. They served the same purpose as gyms, but were slightly different. It consisted of doing some sort of favor or puzzle for the island Kahuna, which would lead to fighting a totem Pokemon, which was just a powered up version of a regular Pokemon, and then the trial would culminate in battling the island Kahuna. I really liked this feature, mainly because it was different from the gyms. I mean, it served the same purpose, but it was a different flavor, I guess. And it also showed more that Game Freak is willing to try out some new things when it comes to their mainline series. The next big thing people will notice are the Z moves, but I don't actually want to talk about this now. Instead, I'll mention Pokemon Ride. This was Sun and Moon's, and also Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon's, implementation of HMs. Throughout the game, you would unlock multiple Pokemon mounts that would perform the various HMs that the players are used to, like Surf, Strength, and Rock Smash. It also took place at the dowsing machine through the use of Stoutland, and introduced a new kind of environmental obstacle, the rocky terrain, which could only be traversed on the back of a Mudsdale. Overall, I think this might be the best implementation of HMs, at least in the modern games. Technically, this functions exactly the same as BDSPs, but the main difference is that you actually see your character riding the various Pokemon, instead of riding an amorphous blob, or even worse, having the action done without any Pokemon visually doing the action. I'm talking about Rock Smash, Cut, and Strength. I'll talk more about my grievances with BDSP's version when we get there though. Overall, Sun and Moon's Pokemon Ride was pretty good. My one criticism is that the ride Pokemon weren't actually ours. It felt more like a rental system where we could use someone else's Pokemon to do our tasks, meaning we didn't really grow as much of a bond with our own Pokemon because we weren't using them. Another big feature that began in this generation was the introduction of regional forms of existing Pokemon from previous generations. Some people expressed distaste for it, but I think most fans like it. This generation only came with regional variants of Kanto Pokemon, but that's fine, because those are the oldest ones, and thus they are the ones that would benefit the most to having additional changes. Maybe that isn't the right way to phrase it, because the Gen 1 Pokemon are fine. They're iconic and likable, but the new forms of old Pokemon provide a twist, a different flavor of the monsters that we already know in and out. It was just nice. I actually think this was the best thing that Sun and Moon started. It's like seeing things that we are comfortable with, but in a new light. I wonder if future remakes of games are going to retroactively create regional forms of other games, like if the eventual Unova remakes include Unovan forms of Galar Pokemon or Sinnoh Pokemon, for example. That's something to think about, I guess. Overall, a good feature. And I think Game Freak knows it because it has come back in every future mainline game that's not a remake. Alright, now's the time when we can talk about Z moves. Throughout the story, you'd gain access to different Z gems, one of each type, and you can have your Pokemon hold it to gain access to a powered up version of that move type, once per battle. To gain that ability, your player would do a little dance, and your Pokemon would then be able to use that Z move. I think it was an alright addition. I honestly didn't care too much for it, but I didn't hate it. I think things started to go awry when they wanted this special Pokemon to get exclusive Z moves, and thus exclusive Z gems. One of the biggest complaints from Mega Evolutions, at least mechanically, is that not every Pokemon got access to it. Only Pokemon with Mega Evolutions could Mega Evolve, but with Z moves, every Pokemon could use them. The exclusive Z moves were kind of a problem because of this. Not every Pokemon would get a special move, but just get the generic powered up one. It turned what would normally be a pretty solid addition into one that just felt kind of bleh. Especially if you didn't use one of those Pokemon with the exclusive Z moves. Anyway, there was one more big feature that the games had, but this next one wouldn't come back, or at least it wouldn't be iterated on. I'm talking about Ultra Beasts. They were a category of Pokemon that came from other dimensions. This was a pretty cool idea, and allowed the designers at Game Freak to come up with more outlandish ideas for Pokemon. I mean, they probably wouldn't have come up with Pokemon like Circuitry or Blacephalon if they couldn't spin the reason for their existence as because they came from another dimension. And it also had a lot to do with Sun and Moon and Ultra Sun and Moon's plot. I think they should come back. The designs were mostly cool, and they haven't introduced any new Ultra Beasts since Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. Since those games, these Ultra Beasts have been treated just like any other Pokemon, even though they are entirely different. Literally. This was the first Pokemon game to really put a big plot twist in the main story. I mean, Team Plasma being ruled by a guy that doesn't actually want to liberate Pokemon from their trainers was kind of a plot twist, but not nearly on the same scale as Sun and Moon and Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. Specifically, I'm talking about how the evil team, Team Skull, isn't actually that bad, and the real evil group is a suspicious organization whose members are dressed in all white, known as the Aether Foundation. The plot was changed from Sun and Moon to Ultra Sun and Moon, but I really enjoyed the climax of Sun and Moon when the Aether Foundation leader, Lusamine, just goes fucking buck wild and merges with this extra-dimensional creature Nihilego to become Nihilusamine. That's not an official name, it's just what I call her. I mean, it was very bonkers. I half expected us to battle her outright, but it was still just a regular boss fight. The plotline also features two side characters, Lily and Gladion, both of which were good characters. They had deeper backstories than like 95% of the NPCs from older generations, and this one too. Both were children of Lusamine, and both have some semblance of a story arc, unlike your actual rival, How. I mean, How is fine. He's the only trainer that has ever made me black out in a battle, cursed you Alola, so I gotta respect him at least a little bit. These games also iterated on the Pokemon Me feature, replacing with the Pokemon Refresh feature. In addition to what was in Pokemon Me, you could groom your Pokemon, and if you did it right after a fight, you could cure their status effects by feeding them medicine. Aside from that, the other main difference between this feature and its predecessor was that you could feed it Pokebeans that you got from the Pokepelago instead of Pokepuffs that you got from doing minigames. This also means that the minigames weren't in Pokemon Refresh. What was the Pokepelago? It was a series of uninhabited islands that you could develop. The Isle of Beans has a bean tree that you could harvest beans from every now and then, and you can also attract Pokemon to this island, and if they enjoy it enough, you can capture them and use them as your own Pokemon. The Isle of Plenty allowed you to grow berries on it, the Isle of Fun allowed you to send your Pokemon on expeditions to find various items, and the Isle Evolup allowed you to EV train your Pokemon automatically. Lastly, there was the Isle of View, which you could use to give your Pokemon spa days, raising their friendship and hatching eggs faster. Overall, it was a pretty nice side feature, but remained limited in scope so you could focus on the actual parts of the game. I approve. This might be a bit of foreshadowing, but this was the first game without a national Pokédex. It definitely got many people understandably upset, but I think fears started to die down once they realized that all Pokemon could still exist in the game. They would just have to be transferred to it via Pokemon Bank, the 3DS Pokemon Cloud service. The imported Pokemon wouldn't get their own Pokédex entry, but that would be okay because the Pokemon were still completely functional. Some smaller things now. This is the first and only time a battle gimmick returns with Mega Evolutions becoming available to the player after beating the champion. Additionally, rematches with the Gym Leader's Elite Four champions and other prominent battling NPCs would use Mega Evolutions. This is also the first time a legendary Pokemon evolves. Not only that, it has a branching evolution. I'm of course referring to Cosmog evolving into Cosmoem, and Cosmoem evolving into either Solgaleo or Lunala, depending on if you are playing Sun or Moon, or their Ultra versions. So why does this game continue with the degradation of the mainline series? Well, it actually doesn't. These two games in the Ultra versions are considered the best 3D mainline Pokemon games. At least they were until Pokemon Legends Arceus came out. There was a lot to like in these games, and the change to the gym structure was greatly appreciated. The National Dex wasn't cut yet, and the game was on the 3DS, so people couldn't complain about the graphics too much. The NPCs had enough depth, and the Z-moves were certainly interesting. In addition, the game never took itself too seriously, especially being set on a tropical isle based off of Hawaii. Ultra Beasts and regional forms were cool, and Team Skull, despite being the evil team, was hilarious and wholesome. Sure, it kept some of the more divisive additions from X and Y, but it introduced and changed enough to avoid that staleness that has been creeping into the formula. But, on to the next game. The Pokemon Let's Go games were clearly designed to capitalize on the success of Pokemon Go. Therefore, it brings several mechanics from that mobile game, namely the catching mechanic. It also expanded upon Pokemon riding and following, and to be honest, I haven't played these games, so I can't talk too much about it. The main issue is that no Pokemon beyond Generation 1 and its Alolan forms are available, but since this style of game seems to be a one-off, at least for now, I think any other unmentioned changes don't persist to other games. Man, I can't wait for me to be proven wrong once Pokemon Let's Go Maryland Mareep or whatever it will be called gets announced. Although, I think making a Pokemon Legends Celebi would most likely be a better move to fill the Johto slot in the release order. Anyway, on to the next generation. Yes, I know that technically Pokemon Legends Arceus is a mainline game that is part of this generation, but I'm purposefully excluding it because I have so much to say regarding that game that is different from what I have to say about the other games in this generation. Just a heads up. So, to start with Sword and Shield, it released worldwide on November 2019. Both games would get DLC for the first time ever, with the Isle of Armor in June 2020 and the Crown Tundra in October of the same year. Then Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl released a year later in November 2021. Okay, before we get started, I want to provide a warning. There will be a lot of negativity that surrounds these two games. While I do have a lot of grievances to air, I would like to reiterate that I love the Pokemon franchise as a whole. It has been with me as long as I can remember and was the very first game franchise I ever saw, let alone played. Again, I point out these flaws because I have become dissatisfied with these games, and I'm sure I'm not in the minority. I desperately want Game Freak to make fantastic games that live up to Pokemon's potential, and it frustrates me that despite being the most profitable media franchise of all time, they don't put the required effort in to make each game the best it can be. Anyway, let's get started. The Dex Cut. Pretty much everyone knows about this at the current point, but it was initially the biggest controversy surrounding the game's release. There was a lot of back and forth about whether the decision to remove half the Pokemon from the game was justified. But way more qualified people than me have made videos about it, so definitely search it up if you want to find out more. To summarize the whole debacle, however, Game Freak's justification for leaving only 400 Pokemon in the game, despite there being almost 900 total Pokemon at the time, was that they couldn't balance the game around having so many creatures and couldn't create enough high-quality models for each of them. Then, details rose that around the time of X and Y's release, the developers had made high-quality assets of every Pokemon as a way to future-proof their models. Then, it became apparent that even though they had those models, Game Freak still decided to remake every asset for each Pokemon, and that was eating up most of the development time. From there on, people's attention turned toward the graphical fidelity of the games. This image was a very popular image that circled the internet back in the times before Sword and Shield's release. While I said I wasn't going to talk about graphics all too much, this generation is where that statement starts to fall apart. I mean, look at the tree. Or don't. You've probably seen enough of it. And if you haven't, you can tell why people got upset at it. There were other graphics related and Pokemon model / animation related gripes. Yeah, this wasn't actually a good time to be part of the fandom. Partly because of the dip in quality, but also because of the warranted rising negativity. #Dexit was trending on Twitter in reference to Britain leaving the UK. Countless memes were created about Pokemon getting left behind. I even joked around that they should change their motto from gotta catch 'em all to gotta catch, like, some of them. While the amount of negativity varied from person to person, it was clear that morale in the Game Freak development teams was at an all-time low. Left and right, the Pokemon devs were being attacked for things that were probably out of their control. In response, #ThankYouPokemon started on Twitter, where people started sharing their good memories of playing the games and being in the franchise. I think with everything I've shown so far, it's kind of clear that Game Freak's Pokemon devs really want to make a fantastic game. They want to please fans. There are just a bunch of bureaucratic and logistical reasons why they can't, and I get the feeling that it's mostly due to the fact that they need to keep hitting tight deadlines. Every generation seems to be trying out new things, but the devs don't appear to have enough time to really flesh out their ideas. In addition, Sun and Moon showed that Game Freak was willing to experiment with changing core parts of their formula, as demonstrated by the lack of gyms. Another controversial addition was the Dynamax and Gigantamax phenomenon. This was the game's main battle gimmick. For 3 turns, you can make one of your Pokemon enormous, doubling their health and gaining access to more powerful attacks. Some Pokemon would actually change form when Dynamaxing, known as Gigantamaxing, and they would gain access to a special attack known as a G-Max move. This was also the generation to Nick's Mega Evolutions and Z moves. Unfortunately, you could really only do this when fighting at 7 out of the 8 of the gyms, the battles surrounding the final boss, and in max raid dens. These were multiplayer raid battles, I guess. You could connect with other people and together you would fight a, quote, tough Dynamaxed Pokemon, defeat it within 10 rounds or before you get 3 faints, and you get to capture it and get a bunch of rewards. You can probably imagine that the fanbase was pretty mixed about this feature. On the one hand, it allowed for really cinematic gym battles, where you would be in a huge stadium having the fight, and the crowd was cheering in the background. Actually, they participated in the music, which just raised the hype even more, and when you got to the last Pokemon of the gym leader, they would Gigantamax their Pokemon, and the music would escalate even more as the audience members watched and cheered for these huge, kaiju-sized Pokemon duke it out. Easily one of my favorite parts of the game. On the other hand, however, the max rate battles got annoying, and the Dynamax phenomenon itself just didn't seem super creative. I mean, it's Pokemon but big now, was basically the whole gist. At least for me, it was satisfying enough where I didn't mind the gimmick. I still prefer Z moves in Megas, but I didn't hate the concept of Dynamaxing. That doesn't mean I don't dislike the other parts of the system. For starters, I never enjoyed the max rate battles after the first few. I enjoyed the animation of Dynamaxing your Pokemon, but after getting used to it, I just felt it took too long. Same goes for the Dynamax attacks. The thing that made the battles drag on the most, however, was a really dumb shield mechanic. At certain thresholds of health, the raid Pokemon would summon a shield that could take a few hits for them before breaking and returning back to normal. My grievance with this was how it was implemented. Say the threshold for summoning a shield for a particular raid was at 2/3 health. Now imagine one of your allies knocks it down to 1 HP above that threshold, and then your Dynamaxed, huge, ultimate, uber powerful Pokemon gets to attack. It does this long, epic attack with a cool animation and it does 1 damage? In addition, the opponent sets up a shield. This was my problem. Dynamax Pokemon in raids would just stop taking damage when they reach the threshold in which they put up their shield, meaning that if you raise your Pokemon well enough to be able to 1 or 2 shot the raid boss, you just wouldn't. You just couldn't. It seems like Game Freak was trying to make it so you couldn't breeze through these fights through different mechanics like the shield, or every now and then the raid boss would reset stat changes. However, it was still piss easy, so these just became annoying features that prolonged each battle instead of raising the tension during the fight. Another gripe I have with raid battles that I know for sure other people have are the NPC allies. You would get them if you couldn't recruit 3 other people for your max raid, or if you were doing these solo. There are some decent NPCs, but one of the most common ones is the most frustrating one, and everyone who has encountered him will know who I am speaking of. Just mention Martin's Soul Rock and we'll all collectively facepalm. He would spam Cosmic Power over and over, which would raise his defenses. That might be okay if he attacked occasionally, but Martin is a dumbass and thinks that he can cosmically overpower the Dynamax Pokemon when in reality, he's spending 5 turns raising his defense, and after every other turn, the raid boss resets stat changes anyway, meaning that Martin just wasted the whole raid to continue on his never-ending quest to get maxed out defenses during a max raid battle. I guess. It particularly sucks because the raid bosses are so easy. All anyone needs to do is just keep attacking. Seriously, if all 4 trainers keep attacking with their Pokemon, they can complete the raid faster and more easily than if someone's dumb Soul Rock keeps thinking, you know, the past 16 bajillion times I've raised my defense and special defense by 1 stage hasn't worked. I know, let's just keep trying. It's honestly disgusting how incompetent Martin is, and honestly, him existing and behaving the way he does brings down the whole experience. Anyway. There's one more topic related to Dynamaxing that I would like to talk about. The rewards. I feel they are too overpowered. Specifically, I'm talking about the EXP candies. I think they were a good idea, but badly executed. The reason I'm mentioning this is because it is so easy to gain levels by doing this. Each XP candy, if the right size, could level up your Pokemon multiple times. Even the small ones can level up your Pokemon super quickly in the early game. I think simply making them a reward only after the post game, with the dumbasses Swordsbird and Shieldbird, would have been the right move to make. Then, they can still be in the game, and reduce grind for those wishing to raise Pokemon after they have shown that they can do so the regular way. Also, the amount of trainers to battle for XP dwindles at the end of the game, so the XP candies can start to replace the XP you would normally get by just exploring the map and battling trainers. It's a good system, it's just too useful, during the story at least. I mean, I used it to grind up my team before the champion Leon fight because I thought I needed it, and after a 30-minute grind, I went from being the appropriate level to challenge Leon to being like 10 levels above per Pokemon in my team. I crushed him. Time to dilute the negativity with something that was actually good. I'm talking about the wild area. This was the portion of the map that was less linear, so much not linear, in fact, that it gave you free control over your camera, albeit it was still limited vertically. The wild area would feature an ever-cycling pool of wild Pokemon that could spawn all over depending on the cycling weather conditions. And while you progress through the story, there would be extra powerful Pokemon several levels higher than your team that you would encounter. Unfortunately, these more powerful Pokemon were slightly controversial because you were unable to capture them, even if you could get them into the health range where they could be easily caught. The reasoning went that if you were tactical enough to be able to get a strong Pokemon down to capture range, you should be rewarded with the ability to catch it. The other side of the argument stated that capturing those Pokemon would throw off game balance, to which the original side would respond by saying that they should get to be a little overpowered if they can overcome these odds and obtain a powerful Pokemon. The controversies surrounding the wild area were really mild compared to the blown out arguments over the graphics and the dex cut. Yeah, there were uncatchable Pokemon, and at least in my opinion, the weather mechanic was a bit much. Going from one area to another could mean taking a step that transports you from the middle of a hailstorm to the middle of a sandstorm, both heavily obscuring your vision. Oh well, my complaints are tiny because I like the overall feel of the wild area. It was somewhere where you could just explore, which is something Pokemon has been getting less of as the series has progressed. It also exacerbated the vast difference between the wild area and the normal routes in cities. Since those areas confine you to a linear path and take away your control of the camera, it just felt jarring going from someplace with so much freedom to another that was so restrictive. But that's not me bashing on the wild area, but rather me bashing on the rest of the game. The wild area was also a huge part of the multiplayer experience since you could see other real people moving around it. If restricted to local play, you could get others near you to show up in-game, and that was neat. Going online was kind of a mess though, because there were too many players and no way to just have your friends. Also, the only thing you could do with other people in the wild area is camping. You couldn't battle ordinary Pokemon, do max raid or trade. Those were only restricted to using the XNav, and for max raids they were restricted to just opening up your raid to online players in local play. You wouldn't be able to say, all see a max raid den glowing, all approach it, and all fight the same Pokemon because you all approach the same den but the same Pokemon. It just didn't work that way. I mentioned Pokemon Camp in the previous bit there about multiplayer, but I'd like to go a little more in depth about it. Using your camping equipment, you can set up a little campsite and let all of the Pokemon in your party out of their Pokeballs to wander, be played with, or even cook with. And this was a really nice touch. I personally never engaged with it too much, but it's cool seeing footage online of Pokemon just chilling and maybe having a chat or playing tag. You can play fetch with your Pokemon with a fake Pokeball or wave a toy that they will try to attack. And you could even cook curry with them. Doing so would fully heal your party as if you had just visited the Pokemon Center. As I have stated, it was a pretty good feature. The only problem with it was that there wasn't too much incentive to use it. If you wanted to heal your team, you could play a 5-minute minigame to prepare some food, or you could take 30 seconds to fly to Motostoke and heal up there, and then another 30 seconds to walk back to exactly where you were. Oh well, it was alright. Speaking of flying, the HMs and field moves were quite different from Generation 7. That is to say, they barely exist at all. Right near the start of the game, you gain access to a personal Corviknight that will fly you anywhere you have been previously. There was no Eon Flute style sky exploration, but only the HM Fly / Charizard Glide from the previous generations, where once you selected your destination, you would do a little animation and appear where you wanted to go. Except, this was even lazier and had no takeoff or landing animation. You just teleported. Even dumber was the surfing mechanic, which was the only other field move to return. Kinda. At some point in the middle of the story, you would get an upgrade to your bike that would allow it to ride on water. When you did so, the wheels would transform into these flotation devices and you would ride your bike on the water. I found this to be very dumb. At least with Fly, there was a Pokemon theoretically transporting us players, at least from an in-game lore stance, and not to mention, it just kinda looks stupid. I mean, even riding on the back of an amorphous blob that kinda represents a Wailmer looks better than this. Ugh. But for now, on to the next mechanic in Sword and Shield. I think I'll start listing a bunch of miscellaneous changes before going back into the negativity. This was the first game to introduce regional forms of existing Pokemon that would evolve into other completely new Pokemon. The prime examples are Sirfetch'd, Berserker, Runerigus, and Obstagoon. This game had a lot of quality of life improvements that were actually welcome. You're able to access your PC box from almost anywhere. The Name Raider and Move Relearner were all available for free in each Pokemon Center. No longer would you have to grind for the perfect nature on a given Pokemon because you can give it a special mint and it will change that Pokemon's nature. This was also the first game to not require you to choose between one of two fossil Pokemon per playthrough. Instead, it is possible to get all 4 fossil Pokemon in the same game without trading. Although their designs aren't exactly as cool as previous fossil Pokemon, I found them hilarious and derpy, especially after learning why they are so malformed and the history behind that. And for the last miscellaneous change, there was the addition of Pokejobs, where you can send Pokemon off to help with various corporations around Galar. When they come back, they gain XP, and you might possibly get some items. Okay, the next few things I mentioned will be a little more vague, I guess. I'm gonna be talking about some of the larger, egregious things that happened, and not specific game mechanics. To start off with, I'd go as far as to say the game feels rushed, particularly in the endgame and postgame. The start of the game has all the interesting plot points until the climax. The beginning is where you encounter the legendary dog in the forest, where you get the cutscene with all the starters playing, where you get crowds gathering to see Leon, where you can register for the league. I mean, it's just chock full of information, introductions, and good lore. And it looks alright, too. However, as soon as you leave to go to the first gym in Turffield, the rest of the story becomes extremely formulaic until you have 6 badges, which is when stuff actually starts happening. Well, I mean, it does happen, but your character never sees it. Between the 1st and 6th badge, it's just repeat lore tidbit gym battle route, lore tidbit gym battle route, lore tidbit gym battle route. There's nothing like the SSN and Kanto, the Lake of Rage, and the subsequent Rocket Hideout takeover subplot in Johto, the climbing of Mount Chimney and Pyre and the evil team in battle at their peaks, the infiltration of the Galactic Warehouse and building in Veilstone City in Sinnoh, the freeing of the cold storage in Castelia sewers in Unova, the Pokeball Factory and Energy Plant in Kalos, and the Potown in Alola. Yes, all of those subplots deal with the evil team, but that was good, because it provided a much needed break from the loop of gym, route, rival battle, gym, route, rival battle. With Team Yell being much more on the sidelines, there was never really any opportunity to do this in Sword and Shield. It's not until you reach the 7th gym in Spikemuth that some big cataclysmic event happens, and coincidentally, it's the first gym to be, well, different. What I mean by that is that the town around the gym is actually Team Yell's hideout, and their leader is Piers, the gym leader, who is also a rock star. Also, his gym does not allow you to Dynamax your Pokemon, so that's cool. Anyway, some big explosion happens off screen and you can't actually go to see it. Instead, you meet Leon, who just pushes you away from the interesting stuff and tells you to focus on the gym challenge. This just felt really bad because the older games were happy to let the main character be a part of fixing the main problem. We don't actually get to do that until the climax of the story. I mean, even there, after we've gotten all gym badges and found out that Chairman Rose is the secret bad guy the whole time because he lacks patience, more on that later, the cutscene that happens before we fight Eternatus, who is like the big bad Pokemon causing all of this stuff, is just poorly animated. I mean, all over there are moments when the screen fades to black and fades in with something different instead of animating something happening. There are also moments where the game tries to point out something that happens but doesn't even bother moving the camera to show it happening because they didn't make a model or animation to show it happening. And I don't think it's because the developers at Game Freak were unwilling to do that. The animations at the start of the game with Grookey, Scorbunny, and Sobble show that they are more than capable of animating their creatures well. What this actually speaks to is the amount of crunch they feel towards the end of the development period, and this really starts to show after the game progresses because the post-game plot is just really dumb. You meet these two dumb fuckheads, Swordward and Shielbert, who just have the most appalling hairstyles. I mean, Squidward over here has a penis on his head. There's no dancing around that, it's just right there. And the plot itself involves running to various gyms cleaning up what was left of the Dynamax Pokemon that arose when Eternatus came. There was no plot, no character development, no effort. All of Pokemon's post-games have involved running around a lot or exploring previously blocked off areas, but this one was just different. Even in Sun and Moon, where the plot was literally just running around and catching Pokemon, it managed to stay interesting because it was based on an interesting topic, Pokemon from other dimensions creeping into ours. The Dynamax is just kinda meh, conceptually at least. And Sun and Moon's post-game plot was also interesting because it involved an interesting character doing interesting things. We got to know a lot more about the mysterious Looker, whereas in Sword and Shield, we don't learn as much about previously established NPCs. I mean, imagine if they brought back a character from an older game to investigate these mysterious phenomena where Pokemon can grow to hundreds of times their original size. I wonder if there is some character who was in a previous game who has shown an interest in researching ways to make their Pokemon more powerful. And if not him, how about Cena and Dexio, the Kalos Professor Sycamore's assistants? All three of these people have already been shown to be able to travel to Hawaii, or rather Alola, so theoretically they could go to the UK, or Galar. It's closer, and France and the UK are very friendly with each other. It would not have been out of place to have something like that, instead of Mr. Penis Head and the Pyroar fanboy over here. There were so many opportunities to do something cool, and it didn't happen. On to the next topic. While we're talking about the plot, can I just say for a quick second that the climax of the story just made absolutely zero sense? Okay, so TLDR, or rather TLDP, this guy here, Chairman Rose, is in charge of the Macrocosmos, a company that provides energy to all of Galar. He foresaw some big Armageddon or apocalypse or something caused by a severe lack of energy thousands of years in the future. He wanted to prepare for such a situation by collecting a bunch of energy now so they would have the energy then to avoid the crisis. That's fine. That actually makes sense. To get the energy, he decided to hoard these star pieces, which are strange meteors that emit a large amount of energy and also allow Pokemon to Dynamax. He would hoard them and also use them to summon a Pokemon that just kind of emits this energy, Eternatus. He would bring what's known as the Darkest Day and summon forth Eternatus so he could vampire it for all of its energy. That's a bit less reasonable and believable, but fine, whatever. In this made-up fantasy world, that's plausible, I suppose. Where I and many others start to have a problem is at the climax of the story. The player has gotten all 8 gym badges and is about to have a scheduled battle with the undefeated champion Leon. The whole nation is tuning in, the stadium is filled to the brim with excited fans, and the player is looking to finally be done with the gym challenge. They turn up to the stadium, and Leon is nowhere to be found. The player searches for him and finds him at the top of the Macrocosmos Tower where he's talking with Chairman Rose. Rose wants Leon to help him with his plan. He knows that Eternatus will be powerful, so he wants the undefeated champion to help him control the cause of the Darkest Day. Leon is willing to help, but since there was already a scheduled battle for the night, and it is the most climactic one of the whole gym tournament, the championship battle between the 2 strongest trainers in the nation, one where just about every citizen of Galar will be watching with excited eyes, he wanted to wait, and wanted Chairman Rose to wait. Just one day. The energy crisis will not happen for another 2,000 years. One night, just to wrap up the whole tournament. And then, Leon will do everything he can to help Rose. This is completely reasonable. What isn't, however, is Rose's response. He basically wants to ignore that. He wants to do it anyway. In fact, Leon ditches Rose and decides to battle the trainer anyway. And how does Rose respond? By waiting a night to solve an issue that will happen far in the future, long after he's dead? No, of course not. He interrupts the fight right as it's about to begin and makes a public announcement that he's gonna proceed anyway and bring about the second Darkest Day. Fuck. That's so dumb. He doesn't act the way a mature adult in his position would act. What the fuck? There is no world in which Rose couldn't have waited, not even just a day, but just until the fight was done? Give Leon a chance to heal up his Pokemon and then return to Macrocosmos to help Rose. Even that would have been reasonable, but fucking interrupting the championship match? He knows how important it is to not just the player and Leon, but the whole nation. How do I know this? Well, if you've forgotten his title, he's Chairman Rose. What's he the chairman of? That's right, the Pokemon League. He's in charge of the whole fucking tournament, so you bet your ass that he knows the magnitude of this battle. What the fuck? I need a moment to calm down. Whew. Just a few more items on my list before we can continue on with the next game. Besides the dumb plot holes, the dex cut, the rushed and empty late game and post game, and the meh battle gimmick and its subsequent subpar raid system, I'd like to mention something pervasive in these 2 games. To do that, I'd like to read a quote from Junichi Masuda, director of the Pokemon games at the time. This comes from a GameSpot interview prior to ORAS's release, in which the interviewer asks why the games have been getting easier. And this is what he had to say. Rather than any actual feedback from players, it's more accepting the realities of modern life. Kids these days, or even people who grew up playing Pokemon, everyone is a lot more busy. There are a lot more things competing for a person's time than there were back then. For example, there are so many free games that you can play on your phone now. There's so many entertainment options, so making it a little easier to play is the reason for that. While I'm not going to comment on the difficulty much here, I think that mentality has seeped into all aspects of the games, only 2 generations later. If I'm understanding his words correctly, then he believes that people nowadays have less time to play Pokemon games because they're too busy being distracted by other things. So rather than fight hard for people's attentions by making fun, engaging, high-quality games, he's just given up. He's almost saying, meh, just get your 40 hours in this game and move on. And I hard disagree with this mentality. Right now, playing Pokemon feels like an obligation to me, something I'm compelled to do not because I particularly enjoy the content, but rather because I like the franchise and want to see and experience for myself where it is headed. Other games have managed to pull me in and keep me playing for hundreds of hours even after I'm done with the main storyline. Monster Hunter, and honestly anything made by From Software recently, comes to mind. I want Pokemon to be in that same vein. Even Breath of the Wild, which beyond a second save or master mode there's no real reason to play again, I have. 10 times. Almost, at least. These are games that pull you in and make you want to play them. They want you to keep playing even after beating the final boss or whatever. At least with Sword and Shield and Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, they just want you to get done with the story and drop it. And it sucks, because these games can certainly be the ones that do that. Not every game needs you to be playing for hundreds of hours to feel like you've gotten your money's worth out of it. Hollow Knight and Mario Odyssey come to mind. After beating those games, there are some things you can do to 100% them, but you don't really need to be playing until even the 150 hour mark. And that's fine. The game respects your time and understands that even if it's not trying to be your next 1,000-hour time sink, it can still give you a complete and high quality experience so you can look back on it fondly. Pokemon just seems to be rushing you out the back door, pushing you toward playing the next game. And it has felt like this since X and Y, but for some reason, Sword and Shield was the straw that broke the camel's back. At least for me. This was the one game where I felt that all of this unrefined change was not directed at the right areas of the game, and the changes that did happen were ones that I felt didn't need to change. With that off my chest, there's one last thing I'd like to say about these games, and that's about the DLC. Ending off on a high note before we delve into the dumpster fire that is Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl. The Isle of Armor and the Crown Tundra were actually the best parts of Sword and Shield. Were they the best Pokemon experience possible? No, far from that. However, I think that the devs took note of what people liked and didn't like about the main games and tried their best to address some of those issues in the DLCs. Both of them allowed you to roam around larger wild area style maps with their own raid dens. The level designs were far less linear, with more twists and turns and places to get lost at. Pokemon can follow you, and there are even new Pokemon like Kubfu, Urshifu, and Calyrex. There are also new regional forms for old Pokemon like the Slowpoke line and the Kanto legendary birds. The storylines are whatever, but the freedom that comes from the level design is so much better than the main story of the base game. The DLCs each brought back a ton of old Pokemon that didn't make the dex cut, and while not all Pokemon eventually came back, a good amount of them did. The Crown Tundra also introduced the Dynamax Adventures, which was a new raid system that allowed you to catch all of the legendary Pokemon and Ultra Beasts from previous generations. It involved renting out a Pokemon you could use to fight 4 max raid battles in a row, each without the dumb shield mechanic. At every step you can choose to swap the Pokemon you just fought with the one that you're using, and the team can vote on which path to take, which would lead to a different Pokemon down each path and sometimes items and heals. Overall, a vast improvement over the base game's max raids. And that's it for what I have to say about Pokemon Sword and Shield. Well, actually not really, but all I want to say for now. But don't worry, the negativity doesn't stop here. We still have to talk about Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. These games were primarily developed by a third-party developer, ILCA, who had previously helped with Pokemon Home, the cloud service for the mainline Pokemon games. They didn't work on BDSP alone. They had Junichi Masuda as one of the main directors for the game. It became clear as the months went on that Game Freak outsourced the development of this game to another company so they could focus on their other 2 games in development at the same time, Pokemon Legends Arceus, and Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. But we're not going to talk about those games just yet. We haven't even talked about these ones. Before the game was released, it became clear that both these games were going to focus more on being faithful to the original Diamond and Pearl games, instead of introducing new changes that were brought to the games in Platinum and the games since then. The only new systems from newer games that were brought back to these games are the Fairy typing and the permanent EXP share. They didn't even bring back any Pokemon or regional forms of Pokemon from games past the Sinnoh ones. This led to many problems that were prevalent in the original games to be prevalent here, most notably the lack of fire types. You got the Chimchar and Ponytail lines, the Houndour and Magpie lines, and Flareon. Oh, and Heatran too, but that was a legendary Pokemon only available in the post-game. But besides that, that's it. And this was the generation with a Fire-type Elite Four member too. How did they get around this? They gave him 3 Pokemon that weren't even fire types. And one of the Pokemon they did give him, Drifblim, didn't even have a damaging fire type attack. In fact, Drifblim doesn't even have a damaging attack in Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl. Something in Game Freak's minds definitely went haywire if they had an Elite Four member specialized in fire types and not even half his Pokemon are fire types. Definitely the most controversial aspect of these games is the art style, which turned many people off from playing the game. Me personally, I don't care for the chibi style. I'm not against it in these games, so it didn't stop me from playing them. However, I do understand why people were so repulsed by it. Even so, chibi styles can look good, but this doesn't really. Anyway, I'm not going to go into it as I'm not the best person to be analyzing visuals in video games. I can only comment on the controversies surrounding it. For me, the biggest disappointment with these remakes is how they bent over backwards to try to be as faithful to the originals as possible, despite the originals having flaws that were addressed in the third game, Pokemon Platinum. For me, what sticks out is the Ice Gym. It worked well because in the original games you were in a 2D space and were restricted to move in 4 directions. In the new games you could move in all 360 degrees. They seem to have forgotten this in the place with ice puzzles, however. The game tries to snap you into the 4 cardinal directions when deciding how you'll slide, but in the gym this is particularly buggy, allowing you to bypass the puzzle directly by just running diagonally in the right spot. Something that Game Freak tried to hype up that was just kind of meh was the reworked Grand Underground. It's almost exactly the same, but there are rooms where you can find Pokemon not originally in the Sinnoh region. In your base, you can place down statues that you get from excavating, and they increase your chance of finding similar Pokemon to that statue in those rooms. All around, nothing super exciting. Another thing that felt kind of weird to me was the Pokemon following mechanic. I'm happy that it returned, but it works weirdly, especially when turning around. You and your Pokemon will sort of swap places by teleporting, and this is kind of jarring. What makes it worse is if you're trying to run down a 1-tile wide pathway and you overshot it slightly. Then when you try to turn around and go back the way any normal person would, you have to kind of like push your Pokemon a little bit, and they don't even like move, or like they're not animated to move the same way. It's odd. I seriously don't think they took the time to playtest this feature. The crunch here was seriously real too. I also have a sneaking suspicion that Game Freak knew this game wasn't going to matter much because they followed it up only 2.5 months later with the next game. But before we talk about that though, I'd like to mention one last aspect of these games that I disliked. Of course, it would be the field move mechanic. In the original games, the field moves promoted exploration and the route design seemed to be aware of that. The routes would be littered with various strength boulders, rock smash rocks, cut trees, and rock climb sections. When coming across them in the original games, you would see them, and if you didn't have the HM taught to a Pokemon on your team, it would fill you with a small sense of curiosity. You'd wonder what was beyond there and just how much of it there was. It would give you a reason to come back and explore the area since the mystery builds up on its own. And if you were someone like me, then you would wait until the end of the entire game to finally explore these areas, which was like finally releasing the tension that's been building the whole game. Each route and many towns would have these, and the whole game I would be wondering what's behind them, and finally getting to find out felt so good. A TM here, a healing item there, and so on. All the sorts of things to make a little loot goblin like me happy. Seriously, if you watch me play any video game, as soon as a collectible item shows itself on screen, I must stop whatever I'm doing to go pick it up. This is where I take issue with the remakes. They tied all of the HMs to a Poketch app, which was originally on the bottom screen of the DS. The other apps, I don't mind at all. Some are useful, like the Pokemon status screen, the step counter, and the Pokemon Catch Chain app, and some weren't useful, like the coin flip, but I didn't mind its inclusion. I take issue with this HM app, however. This is because of how I view HMs. That sense of curiosity I mentioned just now gets absolutely obliterated by the field move that we get on demand. Instead of wondering what is behind all of these side paths as you go throughout your journey, you don't get that tension and release by just being able to see those things. It causes these side path blocking obstacles to be completely useless. That's why the on-demand field moves in Alola weren't as problematic. They were primarily used to block progression, not foster a sense of exploration and curiosity. In Sinnoh, the routes were designed differently, so it benefits from the HM system, but not the Poketch app. I think this is probably the most disliked Pokemon game of recent years, but soon after it was released, Game Freak came out with a much better Pokemon game, so we could all just focus on that one instead. Anyway, that's all I have to say about it. On to the next game. As I have stated previously, Pokemon Legends Arceus is technically part of the 8th generation along with Sword and Shield and BDSP. However, since it is so different from the others, I've decided to make it its own section. It came out January 28th, 2022, and even before release, it was clear that this would be a massive departure from the mainline games in terms of how much it follows the, quote, formula. In fact, this game has so much that's different about it that I don't really know where to start. I suppose the most logical place to begin would be the least significant things. And by that, I mean the negative stuff. To be honest, there's not a whole lot bad to say about this game compared to the other games in the franchise. My personal biggest complaint is one that I don't have for the other regions. I'm just not a fan of the new Pokemon. Some are fine, like Hisui and Lilligant, Weirdeer, and Cleavor. I also really like Hisui and Growlithe and Arcanine, and Hisui and Zoroark. I don't like Basculegion, Sneasler, and Ursaluna. My least favorite design, however, is Enamorous. I understand why it's there from like a mythological standpoint, but its design just doesn't fit with the other cooler designs of the Unnovan forces of nature. If they wanted to go with a more feminine and cute force of nature, that'd be fine, but they did not have to make it look like this. The only other two negative things I can say about this game as a whole right now are really not a problem at all, those being the graphics and the lack of breeding and multiplayer functionality. As for the graphics, no, the game does not look perfect. There are a lot of problems with popping and rendering, and the textures and lighting could definitely be better. However, not only do more qualified people than me have better things to say about this game's graphics, I also just don't think it matters as much because the rest of the game is so good. I also think that no matter how valid the complaints are, it will always look better than BDSP, so I can't be too upset at it. And for the lack of breeding, I think it really only becomes a problem for me when I tried to get a Togepi for my 10-year-old, now 11, cousin, which was his favorite Pokemon in the game. I had already completed the Pokedex, and I wanted to breed him a Togepi so he can have it and raise it, but found out that I couldn't. I can understand that with the bigger emphasis on catching, that you could just go and catch the Pokemon you would be wanting to breed, and that's what I ended up doing. But I think it would have been extra special if I could breed a level 1 Togepi for my cousin. Then he could raise it like a newborn pet and form an even deeper bond with it, and maybe even transfer it to other games to form deeper memories with it. And as for the multiplayer functionality, there's something to do with losing items that I'll go into later, and there's trading. But that's it. There's no competitive battle or even pure multiplayer functionality where you can enter each other's worlds. It would not have been that hard to come up with a lore reason for that. You can say that Palkia has noticed that some other person needs help and sends you over to them. I'm not really that into competitive battling, but with the revamps made to the battle system, I think it would have been really interesting to see how it would change things up when fighting other people. As it stands, you can really only battle the same NPCs over and over again. And that's it. At least for the main complaints that I have. There are still a few minor gripes that I have with the game, but I'll mention them as they become relevant. This is probably the biggest and most prominent change that was made. In every single previous game except for the Let's Go games, to catch Pokemon, you needed to battle it and whittle down its health until it was about to die, then you press a button to throw a Pokeball. It would wiggle 3 times, each time having a chance for the Pokemon to break out of the ball, and after 3 successful wiggles, the Pokemon would be caught. This whole system was put on the back burner. Now, you can actually aim your Pokeball when out in the world. You do not need to initiate a battle to catch a Pokemon. You are encouraged to sneak up behind a Pokemon and physically aim and toss the ball at the Pokemon. And once you did so, the ball would only make a single jump before deciding if you caught it or not. This is revolutionary. I did not know how much I needed this to be a thing before it was implemented. Sure, Pokemon Go had you actually moving your finger to throw the ball and you would need to aim it and time it while there, but it felt less like controlling the character and more like me just learning to swipe my finger in a particular way. This does wonders for immersion, especially how in more recent years, I've grown away from turn-based RPGs to more action RPGs with real-time sequences, not to mention that extremely satisfying feeling you get from nailing a Pokemon in the back, them getting stunned, and you getting a higher capture rate for doing that. It's just brilliant. Of course, if you wanted to, you could still capture the Pokemon the old way through battling and whittling down health. Sometimes you would need to do that too, like if you got spotted by an aggressive Pokemon, but very rarely would it be advantageous to not even try to sneak catch a Pokemon. What's that? Was that something about aggressive Pokemon that I hear? Yes, indeed. In Pokemon Legends Arceus, there are 3 categories of wild Pokemon, those being skittish, normal, and aggressive Pokemon. This is entirely dependent on species. For example, all Bidus act normally, all Glamios are skittish, and all Skorupi are aggressive. That's why there are so many memes about Paris, because it's such a tiny Pokemon, but each one of them is instantly aggressive. They also spawn in many maps, and their spawns aren't limited to a specific time of day, meaning they can show up anywhere to just ruin your day. And that's not a complaint, I find it really funny. Anyway, some species are very skittish, meaning they will instantly run away from you if they spot you. Normal Pokemon don't care about how close you are to them, always acting the same regardless of distance, and aggressive Pokemon will attack you if you get too close. Yep, that's right. They will attack you, the player, not Pokemon on your team. Now there's no health bar, but you do have health. I'll delve into that more in a little bit. Back to the topic of different aggressiveness levels for wild Pokemon, I feel this design decision gave rise to two new actions the player could never do before, those being sneaking and dodge rolling. Well, sneaking was in the previous two generations, but it wasn't as developed as this. By pressing the B button, you can start sneaking. You make less sound and Pokemon are less likely to notice you. If you sneak in tall grass, you can even get right up close to some skittish or aggressive Pokemon and they won't notice you, meaning that you can more easily get those sweet, sweet back strikes. Dodge rolling is used as an evasive maneuver against aggressive Pokemon attacks. Basically, you turn into a Dark Souls character and can somersault all over the place. By dodge rolling, you gain some invincibility frames, meaning that attacks would go right through you. I never thought I would get Dark Souls in Pokemon, but here it is, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. Remember when I said that there were 3 main levels of aggression for wild Pokemon and that it is determined by the Pokemon species? That's true, unless it is an alpha Pokemon. Alpha Pokemon are always bigger than other wild Pokemon of that species, and they also start off at higher levels, and they also have glowing red eyes. Any wild Pokemon has a chance of spawning as an alpha Pokemon, and they are always aggressive no matter what the species is. In addition, there are spots around each map with guaranteed spawns of a specific species of alpha Pokemon. Killing or capturing any alpha Pokemon will reward you with experience candy, the size of which depends on how tough the Pokemon was. Capturing them will also let you use them in your party, where they can learn attacks that are only able to be taught by a tutor. And that's all I have to say about alpha Pokemon, except for one thing. While I really like their inclusion, there's one thing I wish Game Freak would change about them. Whenever an alpha Pokemon sees you for the first time, it will do a roar that knocks you on your butt and off your land mounts if you're riding one. I don't have a problem with this, but what I do have a problem with is that you can't roll through the roars like you can in the Monster Hunter games. This one change will make me have zero qualms about alpha Pokemon. This brings me to what happens if an aggressive Pokemon attacks you too much. As you get hit, a black border starts to develop around your screen. Get hit more times and the border and the screen will start to turn red. When you're one hit away from losing all of your health, there's a loud warning noise that plays and the whole screen turns very red. At this point, or honestly, at any point before, you should back away. When no Pokemon are targeting you, you slowly regenerate health. However, if you get hit while trying to run away, or just don't try to run away and get hit anyway, you can black out. In fact, this is the only way to black out. If all your Pokemon faint, you can still run around. Blacking out is a little different in this game. In previous games, you would lose some money and get instantly teleported to the Poké Center you most recently healed at. In this game, you get teleported to the camp, and instead of losing money, you lose some of the items you were holding. However, that is not the end, because wherever you blacked out, your items still remain there, but only for other people. That's this game's other multiplayer feature. When connected to the internet, you can run around the maps and rescue satchels of other players that have blacked out. When you do so, they get their items back, and you get some points for doing so, which can be redeemed later for XP candies or trade evolution items at the main hub. That also means that if you're connected to the internet and you have blacked out, someone can return your lost items back to you. This is a fairly good system, as it doesn't make blacking out super harsh, but still disincentivizes dying. It also rewards those that pick up satchels and helps out other players. It also rewards those that pick up the satchels and help out other players. The one problem that I can see is that you need both an internet connection and a valid NSO subscription. So those without either of them do permanently lose their items when blacking out. They don't pass up on the rewards for picking up satchels because I think that the game generates fake dropped satchels for those that aren't playing online. Moving on, something that isn't mentioned often is that because the game's main focus is on that whole new catching system, battling takes a bit more of a backseat. Now, battling is only necessary for some story beats, but the main boss fight still involves some of that catching system. More on this later. There are no more wild trainers that will challenge you to fights until after the main story is beaten. The only way to battle someone aside from those post-game random misfortune sister encounters is to initiate one at the dojo or through fighting NPCs as the story progresses. And this part I am a little torn on. I understand that the game wants to put a bigger emphasis on catching rather than battling, and I appreciate that, but I also feel like they have changed enough of the battle system to warrant putting it a little more forward. The result is that the plot focuses a lot more on battling, but the actual exploration of the maps and what you'll be spending the majority of your playtime doing is anything but battling. Thus, the plot feels separated from the rest of the game, minus the boss fights. Anyway, that's all I have to say about that. Next up, I mentioned some boss fights previously, and this is another subject I would like to go into a bit more. Every map has a super powerful Pokemon that watches over it, known as a Lord. They are, in order, Kleavor, Hisuian, Lilligant, Arcanine, Electrode, and Avalugg. They have become enraged and powered up because of the space-time rifts, and it is your job to quell their fury. To do this, you gather their favorite foods and mix it into a medicine, and then you head into battle. However, instead of having a typical Pokemon battle, there is an actual boss fight sequence. This reuses the Pokeball throwing system, but you throw the bombs that you have made at the Pokemon instead of the Pokeballs. All the while, you need to move around and dodge their attacks. Each Lord has their own gimmicks to their fight, but none of them are particularly difficult, especially if you're used to that style of combat from other games. Once you have whittled down their health bar a little more, you have the option to send in your Pokemon to fight it and stun it for a bit longer, provided you win the fight, or you can keep throwing bombs at it until it gets back up and starts attacking you again. And you basically just repeat that until the health bar reaches 0. After quelling the frenzy of the Lords, there are a few other boss fights that are very similar to that, those being against either Primal Dialga or Primal Palkia, and the secret final boss, Arceus himself. All around, I loved this system. As I stated before, I've started to move away from turn-based RPGs, so Pokemon adopting systems from other games that I have been enjoying recently really helps me get more into it. However, this opinion is definitely one formed based on personal preference, so I completely understand if it's not for everyone. Back to the capture mechanics, another way the game blocks progression is through your Galaxy Expedition rank. Essentially, you're helping Professor Laventon with his research of the Hisuian Pokemon, and to do that, you need to go out and interact with the wild creatures. This is done through catching and battling, and the more Pokemon you catch, the more points you earn toward the next rank. Leveling up through the ranks allows you to craft a new type of Pokeball, raise higher level Pokemon, and progress through the story. You don't need all 10 ranks to finish the story or the post-game, but you get tangible rewards for the first 9 ranks, so it is worth it to do them anyway. As you catch and battle against and with wider variety of Pokemon, you may start to fill out your Pokedex. However, filling out the Pokedex is a little different in this game compared to past ones. No longer is owning one of the species enough, you now must complete research goals, some of which do involve catching the Pokemon, but others may involve battling with them or against them. Once you've gotten 10 research points in a Pokedex entry, then that entry is counted as complete. That's when you get Professor Laventon's blurb about the Pokemon. As with many previous games, completing the Pokedex awards you with the Shiny Charm, which increases the odds of finding a shiny Pokemon. Unfortunately, the last few Pokedex entries get quite tedious to fill out, especially if you're someone that likes to completionist every game, like me. I like to do that. Completing the Pokedex along with getting the Shiny Charm also lets you get the secret boss fight against Arceus, which is probably the best fight in the entire game. However, to get to that point, as I have mentioned, you need to complete the Pokédex, which involves getting every single unknown form, of which there are one of each scattered around all of the maps, and all of the Spiritomb Wisps, which are like Korok seeds, except getting all of them is necessary to get a tangible and not shitty reward. Pun intended. Something that meshes very well with the new catching mechanics is something else I didn't think would be in Pokemon. Crafting. Throughout the world, you can send out your Pokemon to gather materials for you, like berries, tumblestones, iron chunks, and apricorns. You can then craft them into various items, including Pokeballs and medicines. You get the gist. You can also guess, if you haven't already played the game, that some of the more powerful items like revives, max potions, and ultra balls are not available at the start and are unlocked as you progress through the game. One thing I wish to add to the system is for the grid items to be craftable from the previous tier instead of just trading them to Zissou. I don't know, that just makes sense to me. Or maybe you can get the recipes from her. I would also like for the iron chunk drop rates to increase, but these are very minor complaints to a very good system that complements the main feature of the game, the catching, as well as the second most prominent feature, the more open maps. But more on that later. Once you reach a certain point in the game, mass outbreaks will start to spawn. They're not a mind-blowing feature, but they're cool. Essentially, a group of a single type of Pokemon will spawn in one of the maps and you can go to their spawning location. You can either battle or catch a bunch of them. The main draw of the mass outbreaks is that the shiny odds are increased. The big update that happened after release includes the massive mass outbreaks, where there are mass outbreaks all over a single map and you get to encounter around 3 to 5 of them before they all disappear. Another neat mechanic, but one that ultimately doesn't add much to those that don't shiny hunt. Another minor complaint that I have about the game is its tutorial. Basically, it's too long. I understand that this is a new Pokemon game with completely new mechanics for the franchise, but man, the tutorial really drags on. The first time, I didn't mind, but on subsequent playthroughs the tutorial is really forced upon the players, like in every other Pokemon game. There is no option to skip it if you are already familiar with said mechanics. Again, that's a pretty minor complaint though. Now on to the points of the plot and the tangentially related topics that I wish to touch on. If you are unaware, the main character is isekai'd back away from the modern Sinnoh region into the past, a couple hundred years ago, back when the region was called Hisui. Because of this, there are no major roads or settlements apart from 3, Jubilife Village and the Diamond and Pearl clans. The Diamond and Pearl clans are always butting heads, and the Jubilife Village is kind of the peacekeeping third party to them. The big things the two clans fight about over is religion. Yuck. Specifically, they argue who the true god of the region is. Of course, we as the player know it is Arceus, but the clans are arguing over whether it is Dialga or Palkia. It's slightly made more confusing because everyone in the Hisui region refers to the god of the universe as the almighty Sinnoh. So the Pearl clan describes Sinnoh, the god, the same way one might describe Palkia, and the Diamond clan describes him like anyone else would, but for Dialga. This view takes a large section of the plot and provides a sort of backdrop to the region's qualms and quarrels that are largely gone by modern times. As mentioned previously, the main story points center around quelling the lords, which are Hisuian Pokemon that guard each map. These lords have begun going crazy and have started posing a threat to innocent people, so it is up to the player to calm them down and more importantly stop whatever is causing them to attain their frenzy. One thing that was very obvious was that many of the NPCs are direct ancestors of NPCs in the modern games. For example, Ginkgo Guild member Volo is ancestor to champion Cynthia of the Sinnoh region. Leon, one of the wardens of the Pearl clan, is Univa's ground-type gym leader Clay's ancestor, and Chef Benny is related to Wally from the Hoenn region, one of 2 rivals to the main character. Again, I actually like this, and I hope that if there are other Pokemon games set in the past, that we get to see more ancestors of other NPCs. It's cool to track lineages and see how they differ from their modern-day counterparts. It's also cool to see how they differ, since some of them take on completely different roles than their descendants. For example, Cyrus is the evil leader of Team Galactic, while Silene is the tough love but well-intentioned leader of the Galaxy expedition. One is evil, the other is good. Overall, well done to the character designers for these characters. The beautiful thing about doing this is that new players don't have to know the modern NPCs to like the old ones, since apart from looks, these characters are completely unique and have no other ties to their modern day counterparts. I do have one extremely tiny complaint though, and it is that almost every major NPC is an ancestor of a modern day one. I would have liked to see a healthier mix of ancestor and completely new NPCs. However, as it stands, I really don't mind. This is one of the first Pokemon games in recent years where I actually really liked the plot twists that came with the story. If you haven't had a chance to play this game yet and don't want it spoiled, you can skip to this timestamp to avoid spoilers. Of course, there's the kind of obvious one about Volo being batshit crazy and basically causing all of Hisui's problems, but there are smaller ones like Benny being a ninja, Kamado turning on you at the climax of the plot despite him defending you for the entire rest of the plot, and my favorite one of all, Silene actually being good. The entire game I was expecting her to be the villain since she is Cyrus's ancestor and basically started the game off by sending you to your death in the tutorial. It wasn't until the climax of the plot when Kamado expels you from Jubilife and Silene basically orders you to not die that I realized that while she has a tough exterior, she deeply cares for those around her. All I can say is that this sort of depth and storytelling is just not something I experienced in Sword and Shield, or really any Pokemon game apart from the Unova games and Looker, Lily, and Gladion and Hop. Characters like the professors, gym leaders, villains, and rivals, while all perfectly adequate characters, all feel more one note than most of the main characters in this story. To summarize this point, the writing and characters are only second to the Unova games in terms of depth and uniqueness. Something I don't mind, but I acknowledge is ultimately unnecessary, is the evil team. Or rather, the misfortune, since there isn't really an evil team, and they are the closest the game has to one. They comprise of the gym leader Candace's ancestor Clover, Sinnoh Team Galactic's admin Saturn's ancestor Coin, and the leader of the Misfortunes, Charm, who is the ancestor of Kanto and Johto's Ghost-type Elite Four members, Agatha, and Sinnoh's Ground-type Elite Four member, Bertha. For the plot, they really only serve two purposes: to help the Lord Hisuian Growlithe evolve into Hisuian Arcanine, and to temporarily steal the Origin Ore required to tame and capture Origin form Palkia or Dialga at the climax of the plot. Honestly, they could be removed from the plot, and it wouldn't change much. If the plot demands tension to evolve Growlithe, they can just have it come across a particularly powerful alpha Pokemon and have to evolve to get enough power to save the main character, Warden Palina, Irida, or all three. Another thing I really liked about this game was that you really felt like you were helping Jubilife and its inhabitants grow. From the smallest things like helping specific citizens feel more comfortable around Pokemon to actually improving the village's farm or seeing the main Galaxy team building finished construction really helps. Most of the side quests involve helping villagers out, whether it be finding an appropriately sized rock Pokemon to weigh down the lid of a pot, or educating someone that evolution is not as simple as one may think, and Wurmple can, in fact, evolve into something other than Beautifly. It feels good to help the villagers out. Something I'm confused about to this day is the Ginkgo Guild. I actually like them, and they serve as the foundation for Volo's character, but I'm just confused what they actually are. On the surface levels, they are traders, with a D, but they don't seem to have a home base. I think it would have made more sense to have the secret oasis that Kojita lives in to be their home base, and have her be the de facto leader of the Ginkgo Guild. It would also help establish the guild as more of an organization, and help strengthen Volo's ties to her, and also lend an air of authority and trustworthiness to Kojita, instead of her just being this random NPC who randomly shows up at the climax, just randomly having the exact knowledge the main character needs to accomplish their task. I don't know, that may just be me though. Of course, most games with quests have quest markers, and in a more open game compared to its predecessors, you might expect this game to have them. Well, they do. and they're pretty good. The only tiny complaint I have is that you can only have one quest marker active at a time, and changing which one you have active is a little more complex than it needs to be. That's right, I did say this was a more open game. These maps are significantly bigger and more open than any other Pokemon game, even more open than the Crown Tundra and the Isle of Armor. For the most part, quests involve first getting to a place, but you can take any route you want to get there, be it battling every Pokemon from camp to the marker, sneaking past them, or getting lost, confused, and distracted for 30 minutes until you remember that you have an objective to complete. This sort of openness honestly works fantastically in this kind of game. There are great ways of still corralling the players through certain progression points. There is a river that stops you from exploring the whole of the Obsidian Fieldlands, and you only get access to a smaller portion of it. If you explore too far in the northeast direction, there's an Alpha Snorlax blocking your way, subtly warning you that the area beyond him is more dangerous. The other direction you can go in is pretty good, but is most likely the way you'll go, and it will have your first experience with an Alpha Pokemon, the Alpha Rapidash that's there. Other than the Rapidash and Snorlax, there's nothing really dangerous in the starting area, so I'd say it's really well designed. Once you get to a certain point in the game, the bridge opens up and you can explore more of the map. However, there is still an island that you can see and can't get to until you get Basket Legion, and this island has an Alpha Infernape that's at a very high level, meaning that most of the game you'll be wondering what's on the island, and having one of the original starter Pokemon from the original Sinnoh games is a satisfying conclusion to that mystery. However, not all is good. There's one complaint that I agree with that many others have made, and that would be regarding changing the map you are on. To do that, you need to talk to Professor Laventon, have him assess all of the Pokemon you've caught in that expedition, say yes to wanting to return to Jubilife, sit through a loading screen, talk to the gatekeeper again, and select which map you want to go to, and sit through another loading screen before you arrive at the place you wanted to be in. This could be simplified by just allowing us to switch to another map, instead of needing to go back to Jubilife first. It would be a fairly simple fix though. Whenever we have Professor Laventon assess the Pokemon we caught, reward research points, then one of the following dialogue options would be go somewhere else. And when that dialogue option is selected, a map of the Hisui region is shown on screen, similar to when choosing where to go at the gatekeepers, and from there you can switch locales without having to go back to Jubilife first. In this exploration section, I'd like to mention a unique event that can happen when out on an expedition. I'm referring to space-time distortions. These happen randomly, once every 10 to 20 minutes. A transparent bubble will form around a large part of one of the map, and everything goes a bit weird. The usual Pokemon disappear, and new Pokemon appear and disappear randomly, pulled in from various other times and places. This is also the only way to get a few Pokemon you can't otherwise, like the Sinnoh fossils, Jotonian Sneasel and Weavile, and more of the starters. In addition, rare items like evolution stones and crafting ingredients for star pieces will spawn quite frequently inside the distortion. Danger is ever present once the anomaly begins because all the Pokemon inside the distortion are automatically hostile and will not only attack the player, but they will gang up on the Pokemon that you send out. I really like this mechanic, and it provided a decent enough explanation as to why Pokemon from other regions and times show up. Running around collecting the rare items in Pokemon while avoiding blacking out or losing your Pokemon is surprisingly thrilling, and it helps that some of the rare Pokemon are there too, adding more reward to the risk. Since the purpose of this video is to lay the groundwork for future videos discussing specific instances of staleness in the franchise, I suppose I should mention another fairly large way this game puts a twist on the classic formula. That being that Pokemon Centers do not exist for the first time in a mainline game. Instead, there are a few camps located on each map that you can rest at and also change the time when you're there. At camp you are also able to switch out Pokemon, craft with items in your storage, and buy and sell things from the NPC there. I've always thought that Pokemon Centers were not necessary to make a Pokemon game, and its absence in Pokemon Legends Arceus only proves that more. Of course, I don't have any problems with Pokemon Centers being included, but I appreciate that this game is trying to be experimental, cutting out much of what has been a staple in the past games to see if the final product can still be as successful as previous entries. This is something that Game Freak needs to do more of. You can't know if some mechanic will be missed until it's gone, And in the case of Pokemon Centers, I honestly didn't realize until far in the game that they were gone, and that I didn't miss them. EVs work a little bit differently in this game, in that they are severely simplified. Every stat has a maximum of 10 points that you can achieve by giving the Pokemon various grit items. To get to the higher levels, the rare grit item you need, but if you have a bunch of low level ones laying around, you can trade them in for higher level ones. My opinion is that while the increased amount of simplification was good, I think it was a bit too oversimplified. Rather than allowing every stat to go to 10 points, I think there should be a total cap, say 50 points across the 6 stats. That way would allow for far more strategy when raising a team. For each Pokemon you would have to choose which stats to prioritize raising and which to not. Alternatively, you could raise all of them equally but never have a stat reach its highest potential. I think if this was the method they went for with the EVs, they should also allow for a reallocation of points. Battle is still turn-based, but is quite different. Instead of speed determining who goes first in a round, it often determines how often you can attack. Thus, using a faster Pokemon than the opponent might allow it to attack twice in a row, while using a slower Pokemon than your opponent might allow them to attack twice before your own can make a second attack. I actually found this to be super interesting, as it felt a little more logical to me. Like, obviously, a Ninjask would be able to attack more often than, say, a Bronzong. This also means that priority moves like Quick Attack work differently, instead of allowing you to attack more often instead of before your opponent. This change to the turn system also enabled the introduction of new ways to attack, those being the strong style and the agile style. When choosing which move to make, you can have it be made using one of these two styles, or just act like normal. When attacking using one of the other styles, you consume twice as much PP, but gain various detriments and bonuses. Agile style allows you to attack more often, but lowers the base power of the attack. Strong attack causes you to attack less often, but raises the attack power and accuracy of your attacks. I actually really enjoy this feature, combined with the reworked turn system. I always thought that the battle system needed a bit of a shakeup, and this was a great way to do it. It had the perfect blend of simplicity and strategy that made me grow fond of this new system. I'm not sure if it should completely replace the old one, but it felt really good to play a turn-based Pokemon game that functioned inherently different than what I've been playing for the past 20 years. Something else I liked about this is that it felt a little more substantial than just introducing a new ability or attack into the meta. This system allowed every move to be fundamentally different depending on if you wanted to try and sneak in an extra, less powerful attack, or gamble on potentially allowing your opponent to go twice in exchange for your attack to maybe feint them before they get a chance to do so, since the move was powered up. Something that's cool that was added was the ability to move your player and camera around during the fight. That way, you can get the angle you want in it. If you travel too far away from the battle, it will ask you if you want to run. While this feature is neat, it comes at the cost of some higher quality attack animations. While most of the animations from the previous generation were terrible, where even physical moves would involve the Pokemon jumping in place and shooting a fist or foot projectile at the opponent, some of the attack animations were actually extremely cool, like Behemoth Blade or the G-Max moves. The attack animations in Pokemon Legends Arceus are all a bit more consistent. It doesn't reach the heights of the other animations, but the creatures actually move near their opponent before attacking, so that's a major improvement. One of the smaller changes that would have been extremely significant in any other game was how the status effects were reworked, specifically to the frozen status and the sleep status. Sleep now has a % chance to miss instead of 100%. Because of this, Pokemon take longer to wake up from drowsiness, leading to this status becoming more akin to paralysis. Frozen was replaced by Frostbite, which damages opponents after every one of their turns, making it work just like poison. There are a few other statuses that work the same, those being Splinters from Stealth Rocks and Spikes, and Ceaseless Edge from Hisuian Samurott. There's also the Obscured status effect, which is a buff Pokemon can normally apply to themselves. It makes attacks more likely to miss them, but wears off after a few rounds. Focus Energy is also in this game, but barely worth talking about, and that's it. All of the status effects have been removed, like Infatuation, Confusion, and Leech Seed. Area effects have also been removed, like Weather, Terrain, and Toxic Spikes. Something else that was removed was Pokemon abilities. This was kind of a bummer, as I think most of us like or have grown to like abilities. This means that Pokemon like Gengar and Bronzong can now be hit by ground type attacks. While I can understand some fans getting upset at the removal of this feature, I personally don't mind. I can imagine it would be hard enough to balance around the new Agile and Strong styles, as well as the new reworked, well, everything. So to simplify the battling just a little bit, it's fine that abilities got nixed in my book. Would I want them to come back in the next Legends game? Absolutely, but I'm not mad that it's not in the one that we got. Another aspect to how battles got reworked was how stat boosting works. Instead of being able to raise each of the 5 stats plus accuracy and evasion by 1 stage to a maximum of 6 stages, each stat can only be raised once, except for accuracy and evasion. Evasion is covered by the obscured status, and accuracy is kinda left out to dry. In addition, when you raise your offensive stats, you raise both your attack and special attacks simultaneously, and the same goes for defense and special defense. No more can you spend 5 turns in a row raising your attack and defense hoping to become an immortal god. Now, you physically can't. Each status only lasts for a few turns, and using the move again only refreshes how many turns it will take for stat boosts to wear off. This is definitely a nerf to stat boosts, but honestly, I kinda appreciate it. I think it encourages the use of other battle mechanics and helps prevent single Pokemon from sweeping entire teams. I know that there will be others that disagree with me, so if you're one of those people, definitely leave a comment down below explaining your thought process as to why the stat boosts should remain as they were. One of the quality of life changes made in this game is that you can choose when your Pokemon evolves. Before, if your Pokemon met the evolution requirements after a battle, they would start evolving immediately, and you would have to press B to stop it. This is disregarding trait and evolution stone evolutions. Now, they don't do that, and you can initiate their evolution when the time is right by pressing the button in the party menu. Effectively, you choose when it starts instead of when it stops. You can rename your Pokemon at any time outside of battle and dialogues by opening your Pokemon menu, selecting a Pokemon, and choosing the correct option. You can also use the sub-menu to switch out your Pokemon movesets. This is something you weren't able to do in the previous Pokemon games unless you talked to a certain NPC at a certain spot, and in the games prior to the 8th generation you needed a heart scale for each move you wanted to switch out. Overall, these are good features. It's handy if I want to go exploring, then I can put False Swipe on my Samurott, but I can switch it out to Slash if I intend to be battling. Or if I'm going into an area with a lot of rock and fire Pokemon, I can switch out my team's moves to favor using ground or water type moves. It's very handy and useful. Of course, how could I not mention the HMs and field moves that this game has? It's kinda similar to Sun and Moon's implementation, but a bit more seamless with less transition. When using your Celestica flute, you can cause various Pokemon to just appear out of thin air with you riding it. You have Weirdeer that acts as your bike, Ursaluna is your dowsing machine, Basculegion is surf, Sneasler is rock climb, and Hisui and Braviary is the fly. However, rock climb and fly are a bit different. Rock climb lets you vertically scale most walls, and fly is more of a hover. Although if you initiate it from the ground, Braviary will fly you up a bit so you can actually hover a far distance. Yeah, my overall opinion of this kind of field move is that it's alright. It serves its purpose without being overly obtuse or unnecessary. I just kinda wish there was a bit more to it, since these Pokemon aren't your own. You are forming a bond with a completely wild Pokemon that you have not caught. While there's no real problem with that, it kind of diminishes the relationship you have with other Pokemon that you have actually caught, since they could theoretically be able to do these things. For example, if you caught your own Teddiursa and raised it all the way to an Ursaluna, then used a completely different Ursaluna to ride, it feels kinda bad. You should be able to use your own Pokemon to ride. That's basically what I'm saying. With the field moves came some of the minigames. Basically, apart from the very first one, the minigames feature a bunch of balloons placed around each map, and you need to use your mounts to run into the balloons, popping them. The first minigame is kinda similar, but instead of using the mounts, you throw balls at the balloons. They are pretty fun, but ultimately not that rewarding. I think the formula of a Legends game definitely shows a lot of promise because it takes place in the past. This helps immensely when fleshing out the lore and history of the Sinnoh region, and if Game Freak were to do the same thing for other regions, it would be extremely interesting. Even besides the greater lore implications, it also gives us insight about the heritage of some famous NPCs from the modern games. I think what could also be cool are games set in the future. That way we can see the fallout of events that happened in modern games and see what becomes of our favorite and least favorite characters and their descendants. Oh well, we can only wait and see if Game Freak intends on iterating more on Pokemon Legends Arceus' success. To close off this section about Pokemon Legends Arceus, I'd like to talk a little more broadly about the overall feel of the game. First and foremost, one of the things many people had problem with in Sword and Shield was how the battle effects dragged on battles. Not because they had long animations individually, but because every single change that happened had to have its own dedicated moment of the round. Luckily, Pokemon Legends Arceus has consolidated many of the effects, and this also goes beyond mid-battle slogs. After the fight, play resumes immediately, and a small pop-up on the side of the screen appears showing all the experience gains, level ups, and Pokemon that can evolve simultaneously. After catching a Pokemon with a full party, the game doesn't ask you if you want to view the summary of the Pokemon, swap it with one in your party, or send it to the ranch or PC. Instead, it just sends it to the ranch automatically. So much less tedium removed. It's almost beautiful. Last topic, this game, more than any other mainline game, shows that Pokemon games don't need to carry over traditions from past games and still be considered a Pokemon game. Sure, it strays the farthest from the formula out of all of them, but I think that's exactly what I and many others have been wanting. It seems like Game Freak has really sat down and thought about what things they want to put in the game from previous entries in the series, and what could be left out. In the end, they delivered on a Pokemon game that didn't have Pokemon centers. It didn't have gyms. It barely had a rival and an evil team. However, and most importantly, it is still a Pokemon game. If Game Freak can just understand that the core of Pokemon is not fighting 8 gyms and then an evil team and then the Elite Four and the champion, instead, Pokemon is purely about collecting creatures of all various shapes and sizes, ranging from small to big, cute to cool, and common to rare. Then, as long as they keep that core aspect in future titles, they will still have a successful game. By no means am I advocating for the removal of staple mechanics like bike, surf, or gym badges. All I'm trying to say is that across the entire Pokemon franchise, whether it is the mainline games, spin-offs, the card game, the anime, or even the merchandise, one thing remains consistent. People enjoy collecting Pokemon. It feels like prior to this game, Game Freak didn't understand that when developing their mainline games. They felt Pokemon was about getting 8 badges, that it was about gaining progression through field moves, that it was about becoming the Pokemon champion. It feels like they forgot the motto of the whole franchise. Gotta catch 'em all. Fortunately, with this game they appear to have realized what they were doing. No, Legends Arceus is not a perfect game, far from it, but it does so much right that every other game since probably Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald hasn't done, that it is just refreshing. They figured out that Pokemon games are about acquiring the titular Pokemon, and they have developed a game centered around that core concept. That is to be praised and continued in future titles. Whew. That was a long one. As I have stated previously, I plan on making a whole series of videos like this, going into detail about specific aspects of the formula and how I think they can be improved. This video mainly serves as the background for those ones. Later videos in this series won't be nearly as long. It's kind of funny. I started planning out the different topics I was going to talk about, thinking that the video was probably gonna be around 20 to 30 minutes long, but oh boy, did it not turn out that way. I guess I just have so much to say about the franchise that I hold nearest and dearest to my heart. Anyway, if you agreed with and or liked what I have said, then leave a like. If you didn't, then leave a dislike and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Most importantly, subscribe for more, as this won't be the last that I'm going to say about Pokemon. Also, when Scarlet and Violet come out, I plan on streaming it right here on YouTube, so if that interests you, definitely stop by. Anyway, this video's dragged on long enough. I hope you all have a good day and a night, and I'll catch you all next time.